handcuffs were too tight. Adaeze could feel the cold metal pressing into her wrists, cutting into the skin where her pulse beat the hardest. She sat on the concrete floor of the detention cell, her back against the damp wall, her body shaking. Not from cold, though the room was cold, but from something much deeper, something that was building inside her like a storm that had no name yet. Her name was Adaeze Okonkwo. She was 23 years old, and tonight, in a detention facility on the outskirts of Lagos, with no lawyer, no family, and no one who knew where she was about to give birth. She had known Emeka Eze for less than a year. She had met him twice before the wedding, once at a family gathering in her father's house in Anambra, and once at the ceremony itself. Both times, he had spoken very little to her directly. He had spoken mostly to her father and her uncles, discussing things she was not invited to hear. She sat at the edge of those conversations like furniture, present, not consulted. Emeka Eze was a large man in many ways. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a loud voice that could fill a room without effort. He wore expensive clothes, drove expensive cars, and surrounded himself with men who laughed at his jokes before the jokes were finished. People in Onitsha called him the Alpha King, not to his face mostly, but in the way people speak about powerful men when those men are not listening. They said it with a mixture of respect and wariness, the way you might speak about a river that has both fed your crops and swallowed your neighbor's canoe. Her father had called the marriage a great opportunity. Her mother had cried but said nothing that would stop it. Her younger sisters had looked at Adaeze the morning of the wedding with expressions that were hard to read, something between envy and sorrow, as though they were watching her walk through a door that only opened from one side. She had not loved Emeka on the day she married him. She had not expected to, immediately. She had hoped that love was something that could grow over time, like a plant that starts small and slow and then, given water and light, becomes something real. She had been willing to try. But Emeka's compound was not a place where things grew quietly. It was a place of rules and arrangements and expectations spoken so softly that you only realized you had broken one after you were already in trouble. There were two other wives before her. Caroline the first, who moved through the compound like a woman who had long since stopped expecting anything, and had made her peace with that. And Ngozi the second, who was pleasant to Adaeze's face and careful behind her back. Not cruel exactly, but watchful in the way people are watchful when they are protecting what little space they have. Adaeze was the third wife. She was given a room on the upper floor of the main house, a wardrobe she was told not to fill too full, and a set of expectations so long and so detailed that she spent her first 3 weeks simply trying to remember them all. She was not to leave the compound without telling someone. She was not to use the phone in the parlor for personal calls. She was not to speak to Emeka's business associates unless spoken to first. She was to prepare his meals on certain days but not on others. Those days having a rotation she was given on a piece of paper that she read until she had memorized it. She followed the rules. She followed them carefully, the way a person follows a path in the dark, one step at a time, arms slightly out, not entirely sure where the edges are. She became pregnant 7 months after the wedding. She found out on a Thursday morning, alone in her room, with a test she had bought herself from a pharmacy near the gate of the compound. She sat with the result in her hands for a long time before she felt anything clearly. Then she felt something that she later understood was not joy exactly, but possibility. The sense that something had shifted, and that the shift might not be bad. She told Emeka that evening. He was sitting in the downstairs parlor with 2 of his associates, watching a football match. She waited until the other men had stepped out. Then she sat beside him and told him quietly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. He said, "Make sure you eat well." Then he turned back to the television. That was the entirety of the conversation. She had not known then that the pregnancy would end the way it did. She had not known that within 2 months she would be accused of something she had never done, and that the accusation would come not from a stranger but from the man whose child she was carrying. The allegation was straightforward on paper. A sum of money had disappeared from household accounts, a significant amount, managed by Emeka's household manager, a quiet man named Desmond who had worked in the compound for 11 years. The money was gone. And Emeka's people, when asked about it, produced documents suggesting that Adaeze had access to those accounts and that the transactions had originated from her. The documents were not real. Anyone who looked carefully could see they were not real. But careful looking requires time, and time requires someone to care enough to spend it. And in the days after the accusation, no one was spending anything on Adaeze's behalf. She was arrested on a Wednesday morning. 2 police officers came to the compound. She was in the kitchen when they arrived. She had not finished her breakfast. She would think about that later. The half-eaten piece of bread on the kitchen table, the cup of tea that was still warm. She would think about it the way your mind holds small details when the large ones are too much to carry. She asked to call her family. She was told she would be allowed to make a call later. Later never came. She was taken to the detention facility and processed as a suspect in a case of financial fraud. She was 7.5 months pregnant. This fact was noted in the paperwork. It changed nothing about how she was handled. The cell she was placed in held 6 women. Some of them were there for serious offenses. Some of them, like her, were there for reasons that were complicated or unclear or simply wrong. They looked at her when she came in, at her swollen belly, at her wrists in the cuffs, and the oldest woman in the cell, a stout woman named Mama Bose, who had been there for 3 months waiting for her case to be heard, made space for her on the floor near the far wall and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The days in that cell moved like water that has no current. There was a routine of sorts, meals at certain hours, a communal bathroom in the corridor, a small window near the ceiling that showed a square of sky that changed from dark to light to dark again. Adaeze watched that square of sky the way a person in a closed room watches the only moving thing available. She asked for a lawyer 3 times in the first week. She was told each time that her case had been forwarded and that someone would be in contact. No one was in contact. She asked about her family. The officer she spoke to most often, a heavy-set man who was not unkind but was not particularly interested, told her that notification had been sent. She later found out that no notification had been sent to her family in Anambra. The first her mother knew of what had happened was when Adaeze's older brother, who lived in Lagos and had heard a rumor through a mutual connection, showed up at the facility 14 days after her arrest and was told that visiting hours were on Saturdays and that his paperwork was not in order. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. He could not get her out. He did not have the money or the connections, but he came, and he pressed his hand against hers through the wire mesh, and that was something. That was not nothing. The weeks passed. Adaeze's body continued to do what her body was going to do regardless of what was happening around it. The baby grew. The ache in her back grew. The nights became harder to sleep through, because the floor was hard and her body needed a position it could not find on hard floors. Mama Bose gave her a folded wrapper to put under her hips. One of the younger women in the cell, a girl named Lucy who was 19 and spoke very little, began leaving the thin blanket she had been given closer to Adaeze's side at night without making any show of it. These were the small kindnesses of that place. They were given quietly, without ceremony, by women who had very little to give. The labor began on a Monday night, 3 weeks before her expected due date. It began as a low, steady pressure in her lower back that she had felt before, and had grown used to. But this time it did not ease. It built slowly, like the beginning of a long sentence that does not pause for breath. By midnight she knew. She told Mama Bose. Mama Bose banged on the cell door and called for the officer on duty, her voice large and clear and absolutely certain. "This woman is in labor," she said. "You open this door now." It took 40 minutes for anyone to respond. The officer on duty was new and uncertain and made 3 phone calls before deciding what to do. A nurse was summoned from somewhere. She arrived 30 minutes later, a tired woman with a bag that was not well stocked for what was needed, and she assessed the situation and said that transport to a hospital needed to be arranged immediately. The transport was discussed for another hour. There were questions about authorization, about paperwork, about who had the authority to approve the movement of a detainee at 2 in the morning. These conversations happened in the corridor outside the cell, in voices low enough that Adaeze could not hear them clearly, while Mama Bose sat beside her and held her hand and talked to her in a steady, quiet voice about nothing in particular, about her garden back home, about a stew she made with tomatoes and dry fish, about her grandchildren, about the way morning sounds different in the village from how it sounds in the city. The transport was never arranged. The nurse did what she could. The other women in the cell did what they could. Lucy held one of Adaeze's hands. Mama Bose held the other. The nurse worked in the dim light of the cell with the tools she had, and many of the tools she needed but did not have. At 3:44 in the morning, a boy was born. He was small, but he was breathing. He cried immediately, loudly, the kind of cry that fills a room and changes its atmosphere entirely. Several of the women in the cell began to cry as well, not from sadness but from the sheer fact of that sound in that place, which was not a place where sounds like that were meant to happen. The nurse wrapped him in a piece of clean cloth she had in her bag. She placed him in Adaeze's arms. Adaeze's wrists were still in the cuffs. She looked down at this boy, this small, new person who had come into the world in the worst possible room, under the worst possible circumstances, and who was nevertheless here, breathing, crying, entirely present, entirely real. She named him then, in that moment, before she said anything else to anyone. His name was Chukwuemeka. The name meant, God has done great things. She believed it. She had to believe it, because the alternative, the idea that this was only suffering and nothing more, was something she could not hold in her mind and still keep going. And she needed to keep going. She needed to keep going for him. She pressed her face close to his head and breathed in the way new mothers do, that deep, instinctive breathing, as though trying to memorize a scent that exists nowhere else on earth. Outside the cell window, the square of sky was still dark. But it was the kind of dark that comes just before things begin to change. She held her son, and she waited for the light. And somewhere in the city, in a large house with smooth floors and a generator that never went off, Emeka Eze slept without dreaming of anything he had done. And that, more than anything, more than the cold floor, more than the cuffs, more than the darkness, was the thing that made the night feel so very long. Morning came the way mornings come in places that do not care about you, without announcement, without kindness, simply arriving, because time does not stop for anything. The square of sky above the cell window turned from black to gray, then from gray to the pale, washed-out blue of early light. Adaize had not slept. She was not sure she would sleep again for a very long time, though she could not have explained exactly why. It was not only the pain, though the pain was real. It was something else. A strange, high-alert wakefulness, as though every nerve in her body had decided that now was the time to be fully awake, that rest could wait, that there was something happening that required her full attention. What was happening was her son. He had been given to her to hold through the night, and she had held him without putting him down once. Every time she shifted her position, trying to ease the ache in her back, trying to find a way to sit on a concrete floor that was slightly less than completely miserable, she moved around him rather than setting him aside. He slept in a way that only very new things sleep, deeply, completely, as though sleep were not a choice but a requirement, as though the world had agreed to be quiet for him while he adjusted to the fact of being in it. The nurse had stayed through the night. She had done what she could to make both of them stable, and when the morning officer arrived and opened the cell door, she stood up from her position on the floor and had a conversation with him that was brief and pointed, and made clear that a mother and a newborn could not stay in a detention cell without proper medical support. She said it 3 times, each time slightly louder, until the officer wrote something down and promised to make a call. Adaize watched all of this from the floor, her son against her chest, and thought, this is how things work. Someone has to be loud. Someone has to write something down. And even then you are not certain anything will happen. The call was made. A doctor came that afternoon, not a specialist, but a general practitioner who examined both Adaize and the baby with professional efficiency and declared them, given the circumstances, in reasonably stable condition. He recommended proper medical care. He wrote this in a report. He left. The report went somewhere. Adaize did not know where reports went in that place. For the first 3 days, she and her son remained in the cell. Mama Bose had appointed herself an unofficial guardian of the situation, making sure that the officers on duty understood that this cell now contained a woman who had just given birth, and a baby who required feeding and warmth and basic care. She said these things with the particular authority of a woman who had long since stopped being afraid of people with badges, because she had seen enough of them to know that underneath the uniform, they were just people who responded to being spoken to plainly. Food was brought. Extra blankets were brought, though they were thin. A social worker appeared on the 4th day, a young woman with a notebook and the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who has been given more cases than any one person should carry. She spoke to Adaize for 20 minutes, asked questions, wrote things down. She said she would look into the case. She said this with the kind of sincerity that is real but limited, the sincerity of a person who genuinely wants to help but is working inside a system that was not built for helping quickly. Adaize answered every question clearly and completely. She explained the charge. She explained that the documents used against her were not accurate. She explained who her husband was, and the young social worker's pen paused briefly over her notebook at that name, Emeka Eze, and then continued writing, and Adaize noted the pause and understood what it meant. It meant the name was known. It meant the case was more complicated than a case about money. She asked, as calmly as she could, what would happen to her son. The social worker explained that as long as Adaize was in detention, the baby would need to be placed with a family member, or in a temporary care arrangement. She used careful language. She said, temporary care arrangement, with the particular tone of someone who wants the phrase to sound manageable. It did not sound manageable. Adaize asked about her brother. Her brother had come every visiting Saturday. She gave his name, his full name, his phone number, the area of Lagos where he lived. The social worker wrote it all down. She said she would be in contact. The contact came 8 days later. By then, Chukwuemeka was 11 days old. He had figured out feeding. He had figured out that the loudest communication available to him was crying, and he used this method freely and without apology. The women in the cell had arranged their sleeping positions around him without discussion, the way people in close quarters arrange themselves around whatever is most important, and the result was that he was, in that small and inadequate space, genuinely surrounded by people who paid attention to him. Adaize watched him learn things. She watched him discover his own hands. That moment, when a very young baby first notices that these things at the ends of his arms are things he can look at, and the expression of pure puzzled wonder that crosses his face in that moment. She watched him sleep through noise and wake at silence. She watched him become, day by day, a person with preferences. She told him things, not because he could understand her words. He could not. But because she needed to say them out loud, and he was the one she had. She told him his name and what it meant. She told him about the compound in Anambra where she grew up, the red soil in the compound, and the mango tree that grew at the back. She told him about her mother's cooking, about her sisters, about the way the rains came in July like something that had been waiting all year and could finally stop waiting. She told him, in a voice she kept very quiet, that this place was not where they belonged, and that they would not be here forever. She believed this. She held on to it the way you hold on to a ledge when the ground below you has disappeared, with everything you have, without allowing yourself to think too much about what happens if your grip slips. On the 12th day, her brother came on a day that was not Saturday. He had obtained special permission for a non-standard visit. He arrived at the window in the visitation room with his eyes red from something he had been carrying for 12 days and not showing to anyone, and he pressed his hand against the glass, and Adaize pressed her hand against the glass from the other side, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I am trying. I am working on this every day." She said, "I know." He said, "How is he?" She held the baby up to the glass, and her brother looked at his nephew through a smudged window in a detention facility, and the expression on his face was something Adaize had never seen on him before, something that was tenderness and rage at the same time, in equal measure, neither one winning. He said, "I will get you out of here." She nodded. She did not say that she had stopped measuring time in terms of when she would leave. She had started measuring it in smaller units, in feeding times, in the length of her son's sleep cycles, in the particular quality of the afternoon light that came through the high window. These smaller measurements made the days manageable. She had discovered, in that cell, a practical truth, that when large time is too painful to look at, small time can be survived. Her brother was working, as he said, every day. He had contacted a lawyer, a young man named George who worked at a legal aid organization and had taken the case on the basis of principle because the documents being used against Adaize were, as he put it after reviewing them, obviously fabricated. George filed motions. He requested hearings. He wrote letters to offices that received letters slowly and responded even more slowly. He did this while handling 14 other cases, because that was the reality of legal aid, in a city where demand for help and supply of help were separated by a distance that seemed designed to defeat people. Adaize did not know most of this while it was happening. She knew her brother was working. She knew a lawyer had been found. Beyond that, the details of her case existed in corridors and offices and filing systems that she could not see from inside a cell. What she could see was this: her son, growing. What she could feel was this: a determination so deep and so quiet that it had stopped feeling like determination and started feeling like simply the way she was made. The charge against her was financial fraud. The amount alleged was significant. The documents supporting the charge had her name on them, her supposed signature, her supposed fingerprint. Anyone who was paying attention could see that the signature was wrong. She had signed her name thousands of times and it did not look like that. But attention, like everything else in that system, moved slowly. Emeka Eze did not visit. He did not send word. He did not, as far as Adaize could determine, do anything at all. She thought about this in the nights when she could not sleep, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. She did not find anger immediately. What she found first was something quieter and stranger, a kind of astonishment, that a person could do what had been done and then simply continue with their life, that the absence of conscience could be so complete. The anger came later. It came on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after her arrest, when the officer on duty said something dismissive about her case that she could not repeat because the words had been unkind, and she felt something rise in her that was clean and hot and absolutely clear. It did not make her shout. It did not make her do anything visible. It simply moved through her like a current, and on the other side of it she felt, for the first time since the handcuffs, completely certain of one thing. She was going to be all right. Not now, not soon, but eventually, at the end of all of this, she was going to be all right. She looked at her son. He was looking at the ceiling, with the same deep seriousness he brought to everything he looked at. His small face was a question directed at the world. She decided in that moment that she would spend however long it took to give him answers worth having. And she held on to that decision the way she had held on to everything in that place, quietly, firmly, without making a show of it. Because that was how she was made. And no one, not a system, not a charge, not a man in a large house who slept without dreaming, had managed to change that yet. George Adeyemi had been a lawyer for 4 years, and in those 4 years he had learned that the truth and the legal record were two different things, related, sometimes overlapping, but never the same. He sat across from Adaze in the visitation room of the detention facility on a Thursday afternoon, his briefcase open on the narrow table between them, a stack of photocopied documents arranged in the order he needed them. He was 31 years old, with a quiet, direct manner that Adaze had liked immediately because it did not waste her time with false comfort. He told her what the situation was. He told her what he was doing about it, and he told her, without softening it, that doing something about it was going to take longer than it should. The documents they have, he said, keeping his voice low and even, were produced recently. The dates on the transaction records do not match the dates on the corresponding bank statements. Someone made an error when they were creating the paperwork, and that error is visible if you look carefully. He paused. But looking carefully costs time and money, and the prosecution is not in any hurry. Adeyemi looked at the papers he had laid out in front of her. She had been staring at things through glass and wire for weeks, and seeing real paper, being able to reach out and touch something that mattered, felt almost strange. She pressed her finger against one of the documents and read the date printed on it. "This is 2 weeks after I was arrested," she said. George nodded, "Yes. How can a transaction record show activity from after I was arrested?" "It cannot," George said. "That is the point." She sat with that for a moment. The room around them was the usual controlled noise of a visitation space, low conversations at the other tables, a child crying somewhere, the shuffle of feet on the linoleum floor. "So when?" she asked. Not how long, because she had stopped asking how long. Just when, which was a different question, smaller and more manageable. George said the first formal hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. He said he had filed a request for expedited processing on the basis of the newborn and the detainee's health. He said these requests were sometimes honored and sometimes not. He looked at her steadily when he said this, not apologetically, just honestly. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. What George did not say, and what Adeyemi understood without being told, was that the person who had produced those documents had done so from a position of considerable comfort. Emeka Eze was not the kind of man who had to worry about the outcome of small legal proceedings. He had lawyers of his own, real ones, with real offices, with real time to spend on his behalf. The legal aid organization where George worked operated out of a single-story building in Yaba with 1 working photocopier and a staff of 5, including 2 interns. The difference in resources was so large as to be almost abstract. But George was not a person who was stopped by abstractions. He had gone into legal aid because he believed that the gap between resources and justice was supposed to be filled by people, and he had decided to be one of those people. He worked 14 hours a day when a case required it. He knew the clerks in 4 different courts by name and by the particular kinds of help they were willing to offer when asked correctly. He had, in his 4 years of practice, won cases that he had not been expected to win. And the reason he had won them was not brilliance exactly. He was careful to never describe himself as brilliant, but thoroughness. He read everything, he checked everything, and he caught the small, revealing errors that people who are too confident in their arrangements tend to make. The error in Adeze's case, the transaction date that appeared 2 weeks after she had already been in custody, was exactly the kind of error that George was built to catch and built to use. He filed the discrepancy formally. He attached it to a written submission that was organized, specific, and very difficult to ignore. He did not submit it with drama. He submitted it the way a carpenter places a level on a surface, steadily, without emotion, interested only in whether the thing is true. The hearing 3 weeks later was rescheduled, then rescheduled again. Adeyemi was now 2 months into her detention. Chukwuemeka was 8 weeks old. In that time she had learned more about the rhythms of institutional life than she had ever wanted to know. She knew which officers were reasonable and which were not. She knew that the facility's water pressure dropped every evening between 6 and 7, and that you planned your washing around this. She knew that the meal served on Fridays was slightly better than the rest of the week, for reasons no one had ever explained, and that this small improvement was something the women in her cell looked forward to with an intensity that said something true about what happens to expectations when expectations are reduced for long enough. She had also, in those 8 weeks, become a different person, in small and mostly invisible ways. She had always been patient, growing up in a household where resources were not plentiful, and 5 children competed for the same limited space. Patience had been a practical skill, not a virtue. But the patience she was developing in that cell was something different. It was not the patience of waiting for your turn. It was the patience of a person who has decided that waiting will not defeat her. It was a patience with teeth. She read. Her brother brought her books when he came on Saturdays, whatever he could find, whatever was available, without a particular plan. She read a novel about a woman traveling across the country alone. She read a technical manual about plant care that made no sense to her, but occupied her mind during the evenings. She read a collection of short stories that she went through 3 times because it was the only fiction she had, and she liked the way the stories held complete lives in small spaces. She also watched her son with the deep, thorough attention of someone who has been given only one thing to pay attention to, and is determined not to miss a single detail of it. She watched him learn. He learned fast, the way young things learn, hungrily, constantly, as though his whole body was trying to catch up with the world it had arrived in. He recognized her voice. He tracked movement with his eyes. He had developed a preference for being held at a particular angle, which he communicated by achieving an expression of mild dissatisfaction when held any other way, and which Adeze found, despite everything, genuinely funny. She told Mama Bose this, one evening when the cell was quieter than usual. She described the expression, the small, serious frown, the slight turn of the head, and Mama Bose listened and then laughed. The full, warm laugh of a woman for whom real laughter was something she still had and intended to keep. Babies always know what they want, Mama Bose said. It is adults who forget. Adeze thought about that for a long time afterward. It was at the end of the 2nd month that the social worker, the same young woman, whose name was Funke, came back and had a conversation with Adeze that Adeze had known was coming, but had been pushing to the back of her mind. Chukwuemeka could not remain in the facility indefinitely. There were rules about this, rules that, Funke explained, existed for the protection of children, and that Adeze understood even as they landed on her like something physical. The baby needed to be placed with family. Adeze gave her brother's information again. She gave her mother's information. She spoke about her older sister who lived in Enugu. She spoke carefully and thoroughly about each person, their stability, their willingness, their ability to provide care. She did not argue with Funke. She did not blame Funke. Funke was trying to do something decent within a system that made decency difficult, and Adeze recognized that because she had spent months observing exactly that dynamic in operation around her. The arrangement was made. Her brother, whose name was Ikenna, agreed to take the baby until the case was resolved. He had a wife, a steady, practical woman named Grace, and they had a small apartment in Surulere and the ordinary complications of a young couple. But they said yes without deliberating for long, and Adeze held that yes in her mind as something solid. The morning Chukwuemeka was taken to Ikenna was the morning that Adeze understood what the word grief could hold. She had prepared for it. She had told herself she had prepared for it. She had spent the days before it building, inside herself, the conviction that this was temporary and practical and for his good, that he would be safe and fed and warm, that Ikenna and Grace would take care of him, that this was not forever. She held him for the last time in the visitation room, through the allowed period of the handover, which was supervised and brief. She memorized the weight of him, which had increased considerably in 8 weeks. The solid, real weight of a growing person. She breathed against the top of his head. She said his name once, quietly, just to have said it in the same room as him one more time. Then the officer said it was time, and she gave him over, and she walked back through the corridor to her cell, and she sat down on her section of the floor, and she did not cry because she had decided she was not going to cry. She did not cry for 4 hours. Then she did, finally, with her back to the wall and her knees pulled up and her face hidden, cry. Not loudly, not in a way that made any claim on anyone else's attention, just quietly and completely, and for a very long time. Mama Bose sat beside her and said nothing. She did not offer comfort or explanation or reassurance. She simply sat there, which was the right thing, because sometimes the right thing is just to be present for the grief of another person, without trying to fix it or redirect it or make it smaller than it is. When Adaize finally stopped, she wiped her face on her sleeve and looked at the wall and said, "He is with my brother. He is safe." Mama Bose said, "Yes." Adaize said, "He will not remember any of this." Mama Bose said, "No, he will only know what you tell him." Adaize thought about that. She thought about what she would tell him someday. Not now, not for years, but eventually, when he was old enough to ask and she was ready to answer. She thought about what version of this story she wanted him to know. Not the version where she was only a victim, because she had never felt only like a victim. Even in the worst moments, even on the worst nights, she had felt like someone in a fight, which is a different thing. She thought about telling him that she had spent months in a room that was not meant for her and had learned things about herself that she could not have learned anywhere else. She thought about telling him that she had named him at 3:44 in the morning in a place that was wrong in every way, and that she had meant the name, and that she still meant it. The hearing was eventually held 11 weeks after her original arrest. George Adeyemi stood up in a courtroom that was too warm and too crowded, and presented the discrepancy in the dates with the same calm thoroughness he brought to everything. He walked the magistrate through the timeline. He pointed out where the documents contradicted themselves. He noted that the original complaint had been filed by the detainee's husband, and that the husband had not appeared at any stage of the proceedings. The magistrate asked questions. George answered them. The prosecution's lawyer, a man who had clearly been given this case as a minor task in a busy caseload, did not have answers to several of the questions that were put to him. The case was not resolved that day. Court cases are rarely resolved in a single hearing, particularly when the people with power over them are in no hurry. But something shifted in that room. The magistrate's tone shifted. The way he handled the documents shifted. Something that had been one way became slightly less clear. And when things become less clear in court, that is usually movement in the direction of the truth. Adaize was not present in the courtroom. Detainees in her situation were not always brought to preliminary hearings. She heard about it from George on his next visit, and she listened carefully, the way she listened to everything now, noting the details that mattered, and setting aside the ones that were only noise. She asked him, "Is it moving?" He said yes, slowly, but yes. She nodded. She looked at the wall behind his head for a moment, and then she looked back at him. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I want to do when I am out." This was the first time she had said when and not if. George noticed. He kept his expression neutral, but she saw something pass across his face. A quiet recognition. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She said she had been reading. She said she had been thinking about the law, about the way systems were supposed to work and the way they actually worked, about the distance between those two things. She said she did not yet know exactly what shape her answer took, but that she knew, very clearly, that she was not going to come out of that facility and simply try to return to the life she had before. That life was over. The girl who had drunk palm wine at a ceremony and gone quietly into a marriage because her father had decided it was a good arrangement, that girl had been through something that changed the contents of a person. What she was becoming, she could not yet fully name. But she could feel it, like the current she had felt that Tuesday morning, clean and directional and completely certain. She was becoming someone who was going to use every single thing this experience had taught her. The question was only what she was going to do with it. And the answer, she already suspected, was going to be something worth telling her son about someday. The months that followed moved in the particular rhythm of legal waiting, forward in short bursts, then still for long stretches, then forward again. There were hearings that produced nothing. There were hearings that produced a line of text in a document that nobody could have told you mattered at the time, but that George circled and kept and returned to weeks later, because everything mattered when you were building a case from the ground up. Adaize spent those months in the cell, and then in a different cell when the facility was reorganized, and then back in something similar to the first. The physical space changed, but the experience of it did not change very much. She continued to read what was brought to her. She continued to observe the women around her. She continued to have the quiet, serious conversations with Mama Bose that had become one of the anchors of her daily life. Mama Bose had been in the facility for 5 months when Adaize arrived, and she was in the facility for the entirety of Adaize's time there. Her case involved a property dispute that her husband's family had initiated after her husband's death, a dispute over whether the house she had lived in for 23 years belonged to her or to her late husband's brothers. The case had been in the courts for 2 years. She spoke about it the way she spoke about everything, plainly, without bitterness, with the occasional observation about human nature that struck Adaize as being so accurate that it sat with her for days. "People think the law is about finding the truth," Mama Bose said one evening, watching the square of sky above the window go from blue to orange to dark. "But the law is about finding a story that the system can agree on. The truth helps, but it is not always necessary. Adieze had thought about that many times since. She thought about it one Saturday when Ikenna came for his regular visit and brought a photograph. He had printed it himself, a small photograph, slightly blurry, taken with his phone. In it, Chukwuemeka was sitting on a blanket in what appeared to be Ikenna's living room, looking at something just off to the left of the camera with an expression of profound concentration. Adieze held the photograph. She did not speak for a full minute. Then she said, "He looks like he is solving a problem." Ikenna laughed. "He is always looking at things like that. Grace says he is going to be a professor." Adieze smiled. She carefully folded the photograph and held it. She asked if she could keep it. Ikenna had, of course, brought it for exactly that purpose. She kept it in the only private space she had, folded inside one of her books, between the pages of the chapter she was reading. When George came on the Thursday after the photograph, she told him something she had been holding for a few weeks. She told him she had been talking with Funke, the social worker, about a program that existed for women in detention, a program run by a church group that came into facilities and offered classes, not legal classes, literacy, arithmetic, practical skills. The facilitators came twice a week. Adieze said she had asked to join and had been told there was a waiting list. George said he would make a call. George knew people in the church group. He had helped them with their registration paperwork 2 years earlier, as a favor, because they had asked, and he did not turn away requests for help if the help was something he could give. She was on the program the following week. The classes were held in a room that was slightly larger than her cell, with a whiteboard at one end and plastic chairs arranged in a curve. There were 12 women in the class at any given time, though the composition changed. Some women left, their cases resolved or otherwise concluded, and new ones came. The facilitator was a woman named Patricia, who was in her late 40s and had been running the program for 6 years, and had the particular quality of a teacher who has long since stopped worrying about whether she is impressive and is focused entirely on whether the learning is happening. Adieze had not sat in a formal classroom since her secondary school certificate. She sat in that plastic chair on her first session and felt something happen that she had not expected, something that was almost physical, like a window opening. She had been living, for months, in a space that was deliberately shrunk in terms of movement, in terms of options, in terms of the range of possible futures that felt real. And in that classroom, with Patricia writing on the whiteboard and the other women following along and the world outside temporarily forgotten, the space inside her expanded. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but enough. Enough to remind her that her mind was not a prisoner even when her body was. She went to every session. She arrived early. She asked questions. Careful, specific questions that made Patricia look at her with the kind of attention that teachers reserve for students who are going to exceed what the class can offer. After the third session, Patricia stopped her in the corridor. She said, "What level of education did you complete?" Adieze told her, "Secondary school, no formal qualification beyond that." Patricia said, "Have you ever thought about sitting for your examinations?" Adieze said she had not. She said this the way you say things that you have not thought about because thinking about them seemed too large and too far away. Patricia said, "Think about it." She thought about it that night. She thought about it for several nights. She held it up against the reality of her situation. The detention, the pending case, the son she was separated from, the husband who had arranged all of it, and she looked at it honestly and asked herself whether it was possible. The answer she arrived at was, not yet, but someday. And someday, she had learned, was a word with weight in it. It was not the same as never. It was a direction. She filed it away with the other things she was carrying. The name of her son and what it meant. The photograph between the pages of a book. The current she had felt on that Tuesday morning. She filed it with all the small, real things that were going to outlast the cell. She was right about that, as it turned out. The ruling came on a Thursday in the 11th month of her detention. A Thursday morning, gray and ordinary, with nothing to signal that it was different from any other Thursday, except that George arrived at the facility at an unusual hour and was let through to the visitation room faster than usual. He sat down across from her. He placed his briefcase on the table. He opened it, not because he needed anything from it at that moment, but because he always opened it, and she understood this was his way of organizing himself, of beginning. Then he looked at her and said, "The charges have been dropped." She heard the words clearly. She understood them. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "All of them?" "All of them," he said. The inconsistency in the documents was formally accepted as material evidence of fabrication. The case has been closed with no conviction recorded. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands, which were folded in front of her. She became aware of her own breathing. "When do I leave?" she asked. Tomorrow morning, if the paperwork is processed today, I have submitted everything necessary, and I am going to stay until I have confirmation that it is processed. She nodded. She looked at George, at this young man who had spent 11 months of his busy, under-resourced life working on her case, because the truth was visible if you looked carefully, and he was the kind of person who always looked carefully, and she said, "Thank you." He said, "It should not have taken this long." She said, "No, but you came." He said nothing more. They sat in the visitation room for another few minutes, not really needing to say anything further, and then she went back to her cell and told Mama Bose. Mama Bose held both of Adese's hands in both of hers. She looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Go and be everything you already are." Adese left the following morning. She was given back her dress, which was too loose now, her body had changed, and 200 naira, and a paper with information she was told to review about her release. She walked to the gate, she walked through it. Ikenna was waiting on the other side, with Grace beside him, and Chukwuemeka in Grace's arms. He was 8 months old. He looked at his mother with the expression he used for things he did not recognize and was trying to understand. She took him. He did not make a sound. He studied her face with enormous seriousness, as though conducting an investigation. Then something in him resolved, some internal question answered, and he relaxed against her, and she held him, and that was, without any question, the most important moment of everything that had happened in that long, difficult year. Behind her, the gate was still open. She did not look back. She walked forward, into whatever came next, holding her son, and whatever came next was going to be entirely on her own terms. The first morning of freedom felt nothing like she had imagined. She had spent months imagining it, in the way you imagine things you need to believe in, constructing the scene carefully in your mind and returning to it when the present was too heavy. In her imagination, freedom arrived like light through a window, clean, obvious, immediately different from everything that had come before. In reality, she woke up on the first morning in Ikenna's apartment and lay very still for approximately 40 seconds before she understood that she did not have to listen for the officer's footstep, that the room she was in was quiet because it was simply quiet, that there was no counting of hours ahead of her, that the day belonged to her in a way that a day had not belonged to her for 11 months. The understanding came slowly, like warmth after cold. And when it came fully, she pressed her face into the pillow and let herself feel it completely, without performing it for anyone, without having to hold any part of herself in reserve. Chukwuemeka was asleep in the corner of the room in the cot that Grace had set up, making the small sounds that sleeping babies make, his chest rising and falling with a steadiness that, even at 8 months, she could not look at without feeling something she did not have a single word for. She got up. She stood at the window. The street below was beginning to move. A man pushing a cart of oranges. A woman unlocking a shop front. 2 children in school uniforms arguing about something important to them. Lagos in the early morning, in all its ordinary, unbeautiful, completely alive complexity. She watched it for a long time. She stayed with Ikenna and Grace for 6 weeks. It was a small apartment. 1 bedroom, a sitting room, a kitchen with a gas burner that worked on all but the last ring, a bathroom where the water ran hot on some mornings and cold on others. She slept on the sitting room floor on a foam mat with Chukwuemeka beside her in the cot, and she felt no bitterness about the floor, because the floor was her own floor, in a space where no one had authority over her, and that made it the most comfortable floor she had ever slept on. She helped with household tasks. She cooked most evenings, because she was a better cook than either Ikenna or Grace, and it was a practical way to contribute. She washed her own and the baby's clothes by hand, hanging them on the small line on the balcony. She did these things methodically and without complaint, and she also, in the spaces between these tasks, began to think carefully about what she was going to do next. She did not have money. She had been given 200 naira at the gate of the facility, and that was the full extent of her personal finances. Ikenna had offered to help, and she had accepted his help with gratitude and without pride, because she understood that pride about receiving help from family is a luxury, and she was not in a luxury position. But she also understood clearly that she could not stay dependent on Ikenna indefinitely. He was a good man with a modest salary and a small apartment, and his own life to manage. She needed work. She found it through a woman at the church she started attending, not because she had become suddenly devout, though her faith, never very loud, had held steady through everything, but because the church was a practical network in a way that most people understood, but rarely stated plainly. You went to church and you met people, and people knew people who knew things, and occasionally what they knew was useful. The woman's name was Bimpe. and she was in her 50s and managed a cleaning company that serviced office buildings in the Ikeja area. She needed reliable workers. She was not offering anything glamorous, early mornings, heavy carts of supplies, floors and windows and bathrooms, but she was offering a regular income and hours that ended early enough to collect Chukwuemeka from the neighbor's care. Adaeze said yes. She showed up on the first day in the plain dark clothes she had been told to wear, carrying the supplies she had been assigned, and she cleaned the first office building from the ground floor up. She did it well. She was not embarrassed by the work. She had never understood the logic of being embarrassed by honest work, and nothing in her recent experience had given her any reason to reconsider that position. Bimpe noticed her. Bimpe was the kind of manager who noticed who arrived on time, who asked questions when instructions were unclear rather than guessing and creating problems, who dealt with unexpected situations without needing to be supervised. These qualities were not common in general, and in an industry with high turnover they were particularly valuable. Within 3 months, Adaeze had been moved to a supervisory role over one of the teams. It came with slightly better pay, and the responsibility of organizing the other workers, checking the quality of their work, communicating with building managers when issues arose. She was good at it. She had spent 11 months in an environment where reading people accurately was a survival skill, and she was very good at reading people. She knew which of her team members needed to be given precise instructions, and which needed to be given freedom to solve problems their own way. She knew how to speak to a building manager who was in a bad mood without becoming the object of that mood. She knew how to solve a supply problem at 6:30 in the morning, when the supplier had delivered the wrong product, and 3 offices needed to be ready by 8. These were not glamorous skills. They were the skills of someone who paid attention and thought quickly, and treated other people as though their time and their effort mattered. She saved money with a discipline that would have surprised people who did not know what she had come from. She put away a fixed amount every week in a small savings account she opened at a nearby bank. The amount was not large, but it was consistent, and consistency over time does something to small amounts that she had understood mathematically and was now watching happen in reality. She took Chukwuemeka, at 9 months, and moved out of Ikena's apartment into a single room in a shared house in Mushin. The room was small. It had 1 window, a ceiling fan, and an electrical socket that worked most of the time. The shared bathroom was down the hallway. She had a hot plate for cooking and a plastic storage unit she bought from a market for the equivalent of 3 days' wages. She made that room into something. It took her 2 weeks. She cleaned every surface. She put up 1 shelf. She arranged the few things she had with the same attention to order that she brought to everything, and the result was a space that was small but not chaotic, limited but not neglected, a space that said clearly, someone lives here who is paying attention to their life. That room was the beginning of everything. She found the adult education program through Funke, the social worker, who had stayed in contact in the way that good social workers do, not intrusively, but consistently, checking in, passing along information she thought might be relevant. Funke sent her a message about a community center in the area that ran evening classes, general education, secondary school level, free. Adaeze walked into the community center on a Wednesday evening and registered for the program. She was 25 years old. She was the oldest person in the class by 3 years. She sat at a desk that was slightly too small for an adult, in a room that smelled of chalk and floor wax, and listened to the instructor introduce the first module of the term, and felt, for the second time, that feeling she had first felt in Patricia's classroom, the window opening. She did not tell people at work that she was studying. It was not a secret she was keeping out of shame. She simply did not see any reason to tell them, because her work and her studies were 2 separate things, and she did not need them to inform each other in any visible way. She went to work in the early mornings. She came home in the afternoons. She took care of Chukwuemeka through the late afternoon and early evening, feeding him, bathing him, sitting with him while he moved through the world with the curiosity that had been his defining quality since approximately 2 weeks after birth. Then, on the evenings when the class ran, she put him in the care of her neighbor, an older woman named Patience who had 5 grandchildren of her own, and a great capacity for managing small children calmly. And she walked to the community center and sat at the small desk and studied. She studied with the same quality of attention she had watched her son bring to everything, completely, without reservation. Her instructor was a man named Philip, who was soft-spoken and precise, and had the quality of someone who genuinely loved what he was teaching, and was perpetually surprised when other people did not. He taught English and mathematics in the Monday and Wednesday sessions, and his passion for both subjects was infectious in the way that real passion is infectious. Not because he performed it, but because it was simply there, in the room, impossible to ignore. He noticed Adaeze within the first 2 weeks, not because she was the loudest or the most visible, she was neither, but because of the questions. Her questions were specific. They were not the questions of someone catching up with material she did not know. They were the questions of someone who understood the material and wanted to understand the layer underneath it. He stopped her after a session in the 3rd week. He said, "You have done schooling before." She said, "Secondary level, not formally completed." He said, "You should sit for your examinations." She said, "I know." He gave her the information she needed about the external examinations, the schedule, the registration process, the subjects available. She thanked him, walked home, put the papers on the shelf in her small room, and sat for a moment on the edge of her mat. Chukwuemeka was asleep. The ceiling fan turned slowly. Outside, the usual sounds of the neighborhood settled into their nighttime version, quieter, deeper. She looked at the papers on the shelf. She thought about the social worker who had told her to think about examinations while she was still inside the facility. She thought about Patricia, who had said think about it. She thought about what Philip had said tonight. She thought about the sequence of people who had, over the past year and a half, looked at her and seen something she was still in the process of understanding about herself. She picked up the papers and began to read them. The registration deadline was 6 weeks away. She had the time. She had the preparation, or close enough to it. She had the subjects she needed to review. And she had the discipline. She had more discipline than most people could see, because it had been built in a place that required it to be absolute. She registered the following Saturday. She paid the fee with money she had set aside specifically for it, because she had known for weeks this was coming, and she had planned for it, the way she planned for everything now, quietly, in advance, without waiting to be certain before she started. She sat for the examinations 4 months later. She went alone. She took the bus, arrived early, found her seat, and began. The results came on a Thursday. She opened the envelope standing in the hallway of the shared house, her back against the wall, the ceiling fan in the hallway turning above her. She had passed all 5 subjects, 2 of them with distinction marks. She stood there for a moment. A man came through the hallway with a bucket of water and excused himself past her, and she moved aside automatically. And then he was gone and she was still standing there with the paper in her hand, and something happening in her face that she was not entirely controlling. She walked back to her room. She sat on her mat. Chukwuemeka was on the floor in front of her, working on the project he had been engaged in for several weeks, which was learning to pull himself upright by gripping the edge of whatever furniture was available, and then remaining vertical for as long as possible, which was currently about 11 seconds. He stood, wobbled, looked at her. She showed him the paper, because he was the only person in the room. She said, "We did it." He reached for the paper with both hands, because he reached for everything with both hands. She let him hold it for a moment, and he examined it with the same serious concentration he brought to all objects, and then she took it back gently and placed it on the shelf next to the registration information. Then she sat with him and watched him practice standing, and she thought about what came next, and she smiled. Not a small, careful smile, but a real one, the kind that takes up the whole face. She had not smiled like that in a long time. It was a good feeling. She planned to have it again. She kept the results paper on the shelf and looked at it every morning when she woke up. This was not a sentimental habit. It was practical. She looked at it to remind herself that things she had decided to do were things she was capable of doing. That was the only story she was interested in. Not the story of what had been done to her, but the story of what she was doing with what remained. There was quite a lot remaining. She enrolled in a diploma program at a polytechnic in Lagos about 6 months after her examination results. The program was part-time, designed for working adults, evening sessions 3 days a week, with a Saturday morning module once a month. The subject was business administration. She had chosen it not out of a particular passion for the discipline, but out of a particular interest in understanding how systems worked, financial systems, organizational systems, the machinery that made organizations function or fail. She had lived inside a system that had failed her, and she wanted to understand its workings from the inside, rather than simply experiencing its effects from the outside. The lectures were held in a building that had seen better decades. The chairs were hard. The projector in her favorite classroom worked only when someone held the cable at a specific angle, which had become a shared task taken on by whatever student was sitting in the right seat that evening. These conditions were not ideal. They were the conditions available, and Adaeze had become an expert in working with the conditions available. She met a woman in her first term who became, over the following years, one of the most important people in her life. Her name was Nkechi, and she was 32, and had been working in administration at a medical center for 7 years, and had enrolled in the diploma program because she wanted to move into management and needed the credential. She was quick and sharp and extremely funny in a dry, understated way that Adeze found immediately recognizable, because it was close to her own humor, the kind of humor that comes from having seen things that are both terrible and absurd, and discovering that sometimes the only truthful response to the absurdity is laughter. They started studying together after the 3rd session of the first term. Nkechi's apartment was closer to the Polytechnic than Adeze's room, so they studied there, at the kitchen table, with Nkechi's old laptop open between them, and their notes spread out in the particular organized chaos of people who understand their own systems. Adeze told Nkechi about her situation gradually, over several months, in the way that you tell people things when you are not performing the telling, but simply letting it come out as it becomes relevant. She told her about the detention. She told her about Emeka Eze in the same plain, factual language she used for everything, not bitterly, not dramatically, but simply as the facts they were. She told her about Chukwuemeka. Nkechi listened. She did not react with visible shock or visible pity, which were the 2 reactions Adeze found hardest to receive. She simply listened and then asked practical questions, the questions of someone who is trying to understand a situation clearly. Then she said, "You are raising him alone?" Adeze said yes. Nkechi said, "And studying, and working?" Adeze said yes. Nkechi looked at her for a moment and said, "Okay, I will come on Thursday evenings sometimes, when you are studying, to sit with him so you can concentrate." Adeze said she did not need to do that. Nkechi said she wanted to. She said it in the way that certain women say things they mean, without softening it into a question, without leaving space for the other person to refuse out of politeness. Adeze said thank you, and she meant it. Chukwuemeka, in the way of all children, accepted Nkechi into his world without ceremony. He was a sociable child, curious rather than cautious, interested in new people as problems to solve, presenting them with his current collection of objects and watching their reactions with great seriousness. He presented Nkechi with a plastic bottle cap, a piece of bright yellow fabric, and a plastic spoon, all on her first visit. She received each one with appropriate gravity, and he was satisfied. Adeze watched this from across the room and thought, this is how your world gets built. One person at a time, one moment of genuine goodwill extended and received, and then another, until the structure is real. She was building something. She could feel its shape emerging even if she could not yet describe it. Her work at the cleaning company continued to go well. Bimpe had given her the additional responsibility of managing 2 buildings on her own schedule, which meant she was effectively functioning as a small operations manager, planning rotas, ordering supplies, handling complaints, reporting to Bimpe weekly. The pay had increased again. She was no longer saving small amounts. The amounts were getting less small. She moved, in the 2nd year after the facility, from the room in Mushin into a 1-room self-contained apartment, a room with its own kitchen corner and its own bathroom, in a building that was clean and had consistent electricity from the local supply most of the time. It cost more than the room. She had the money. She walked around the empty apartment on the day she got the key, alone, before she moved anything in. She walked its perimeter, perhaps 8 steps across, 12 steps long. She stood in the center of it. She looked at the walls, which were a pale yellow from a previous occupant who had liked yellow. She did not change the color. She grew to like the yellow. She bought a proper bed. She bought it herself, from a furniture shop, paid for it herself, arranged its delivery herself. The man who delivered it helped her position it in the room, and after he left she sat on it. Just sat, with her hands on the mattress, and she thought about all the floors she had sat on in the previous 2 years and allowed herself, for one quiet moment, to note the difference. Then she called to Chukwuemeka, who was investigating the kitchen corner, and he came at his characteristic pace, which was brisk and purposeful, because he had been doing everything briskly and purposefully since roughly the age of 14 months, and she picked him up and sat him on the bed beside her, and showed him the room. "This is ours," she said. He patted the mattress experimentally. "Ours," she said again. He said something that was not quite a word yet, but was getting very close. She held him, and she looked at the yellow walls, and she thought, this is how it works. You start with a floor and a blanket and a name you chose yourself in the worst room you have ever been in, and you add one thing at a time, and eventually you are sitting on your own bed in your own room with your son. It was not everything she wanted. It was not the end of what she was building. But it was real, and it was hers, and nothing about it had been given to her. Every inch of it had been earned by the particular combination of discipline and intelligence and determination that was simply how she was made. Outside the yellow-walled apartment, Lagos continued. Emeka Eze continued somewhere in his large house, buying things, and speaking at events, and being called the Alpha King by men who laughed at his jokes before they were finished. He did not know that his firstborn son was sitting on a bed in a room with yellow walls, patting the mattress, and learning the word ours. He did not know because he had never asked. And the not asking, which had seemed like power at the time, the ability to simply not look at the thing you preferred not to see, was already, quietly, beginning to collect its debt. These things always do. It is only the schedule that varies. Emeka Eze did not consider himself a dishonest man. This was not self-deception in the obvious sense. He had a way of organizing the facts of his life that made them, to him, coherent and reasonable and acceptable. He was a businessman. He had made difficult decisions. He had made arrangements that, viewed in isolation, might seem harsh, but that viewed in the full context of his circumstances, the pressures of his business, the complications of his household, the particular moment in which certain choices had been made, were understandable. He did not lie to himself about what he had done. He simply did not spend very much time thinking about it. This was a skill he had developed young. Growing up in Onitsha, the third son of a man who owned 3 market stalls and ran them with absolute authority over his family, Emeka had learned early that the ability to move forward, to face the front and keep going rather than dwelling on what had happened behind you, was not just useful but necessary. His father had taught him this, by example if not by explicit instruction. His father had done things in his life that he never discussed and apparently never thought about, and he had been successful, and the connection between those two facts had registered somewhere in Emeka and remained. By the time he was 45, Emeka Eze had built something real, not from nothing. He was honest about that, at least to himself. His father had left him a start, 1 market stall, a set of connections, a name in Onitsha that carried a small amount of weight. But 1 market stall had become 3, and 3 had become a small logistics company, and the logistics company had become the foundation for contracts with 2 of the larger trading groups in the southeast, and from there the expansion had been genuine and substantial and driven by Emeka's particular abilities. His abilities were real. He was not a fraud in the ordinary sense of the word. He understood supply chains. He understood how money moved. He understood people, what they wanted, what they feared, how to make them feel that working with him was in their interest. He was charming in the way of men who have learned that charm is a tool, who use it consciously and effectively, and without being entirely cynical about it, because part of Emeka's effectiveness was that he genuinely liked most people, at least in the short term. His compound in Onitsha was a real compound, not performative wealth, but functional wealth. The generator ran on schedule. The gate was guarded. The rooms were well furnished and maintained. There was a kitchen garden in the back that his household manager, Desmond, oversaw with considerable pride, producing tomatoes and peppers and leafy vegetables that actually made it into the meals. Desmond had worked for Emeka for 11 years. He was quiet and thorough and loyal in the way that people who have found a stable position tend to be loyal, genuinely, because the stability matters, and carefully, because they understand that the stability can be removed. He managed the household accounts with the same meticulous attention he gave to the kitchen garden. Every expense was documented. Every transaction was filed. When the allegation against Adeze was being prepared, Desmond had not been consulted. He had found out afterward, from a comment made by one of Emeka's business associates, and he had said nothing, not because he agreed, but because he understood his position and what it required of him, and the thing it required of him in that moment was silence. He had filed his records as always, because he did not know how to do his job any other way, and within those records, in the natural course of how thorough record-keeping works, there were dates and figures that told a story that the fabricated documents did not tell. He had not thought about this at the time. He had thought about it later. By the time Adeze was released from the facility, Desmond had thought about it many times. He had not done anything with those thoughts, because doing something with them would require a courage he was not certain he possessed, and a willingness to put his stability at risk that he had not yet decided was available in him. He thought about it, and he did his job, and he stayed. This is the way many injustices persist, not through active support, but through the accumulated small decisions of witnesses who choose the stable option, the quiet option, the option that does not require them to do anything difficult. Desmond was not an evil man. He was a man who made a series of ordinary decisions that had an effect he preferred not to look at too clearly. He would look at it clearly later, but that comes much later in this story. For now, Emeka Eze, in the years following Adeze's release, expanded. He expanded in the way that men with real resources and real ability tend to expand when neither is checked by anything, laterally, into new markets, into new ventures, into new relationships with people who had things he needed and needed things he had. He added a fourth wife, a young woman named Chisom whose father was well connected in Abuja. This connection was, from Emeka's perspective, the primary purpose of the arrangement, though he was not unkind to Chisom personally and did not treat her badly in any way that was visible. He donated the classroom block that would later bear his name, in his hometown in Anambra. It was a genuine donation, he had not been asked for it, or at least not loudly, and it came from a part of him that was also real, the part that understood community, that felt the pull of the place he had come from, that wanted to be remembered there as someone who had contributed. He gave the speech at the opening ceremony with real feeling, talking about education, about opportunity, about what it meant to give children a place to learn. The women in the audience clapped, the men nodded. His photograph appeared in 2 local newspapers and 1 online publication. He spoke at a conference in Lagos the following year, on the topic of women in business. He spoke with sincerity about the importance of opportunity and access, about the need for systems that support rather than restrict. He meant it, or he meant some of it, the part that did not require him to look at the ways in which he himself had been the restriction. People are capable of holding genuine beliefs alongside the contradiction of their own behavior, and Emeka was no exception to this common human tendency. He had 5 children. He attended their school events when reminded. He was fond of them in a general way, in the way that men who are busy with large lives tend to be fond of their children, aware of their existence, occasionally present, not entirely sure who they were becoming as people, because the process of becoming is slow and happens mostly in the small, daily moments that large, busy men tend to miss. He did not think about Chukwuemeka, not because the thought was painful, he had not arrived at pain about it yet, but because the thought was in a compartment that he did not open. He was skilled at not opening compartments. He had been practicing this skill his entire adult life. His business continued to grow. He moved into real estate in a small way, not as a developer, but as an investor, buying properties in areas where the growth trajectory was clear to someone who read markets carefully. He was good at reading markets. He was very good at it. By his 52nd year, Emeka Eze was a wealthy man by any reasonable standard. He was also a man who had shed certain things from his past, not violently, not dramatically, but in the way that men who are moving forward tend to shed things, by simply not carrying them anymore, by putting them down in a room, and closing the door, and then furnishing the next room so thoroughly that the need to go back seemed minimal. He had shed Adaize. He had shed the child she carried. He had shed the specific events of that year as though they had happened to a slightly different version of him, a younger version, a version that was still finding his footing and making the kinds of decisions that people in that phase make. He believed this so thoroughly that it had become, for him, simply true. People were not consistent in their self-knowledge. Emeka's self-knowledge was partial in the specific way that most people's self-knowledge is partial. He knew the things about himself that were pleasant to know, and he had filed the unpleasant things in locations he did not return to often. He was not happy, exactly, in the way that would require examining what happiness meant and whether he possessed it. He was satisfied. He was busy. He was producing results, in business and in the world, and results were what he had always understood as the measure of a life well lived. He was not wrong about the results. They were real. He was wrong about what was coming. Because somewhere in Lagos, in a room with yellow walls, a boy named Chukwuemeka Okonkwo was growing up in the particular way that children grow up when they are raised by a person who has decided that everything they are will be passed on, undiluted, to the small person in their care. Adaize had not set out to raise a remarkable child. She had set out to raise a good one. The distinction mattered to her. Remarkable was something other people decided. Good was something she could work toward every single day. The goodness of a person who is honest and careful and willing to do hard things for right reasons. She worked toward it the way she worked toward everything, consistently, specifically, without waiting to feel inspired. She talked to Chukwuemeka the way she had talked to him in the facility, truthfully, simply, about real things. She did not invent a comfortable story about his father. She did not lie. She also did not narrate the story in the language of bitterness, because she did not feel that her bitterness, real as it sometimes was something she wanted to put into his hands. She felt that the facts, when he was old enough for them, were enough. The facts were the story. She did not need to color them. She told him about herself, about her family in Anambra, about the red soil in her parents' compound, about her siblings and their lives. She told him about what she had studied and why studying mattered. and she showed him rather than told him by sitting at the table every evening with her books. He grew up watching her study. He grew up watching her go to work before daylight. He grew up watching her save and budget and plan, watching her make decisions and explain them, watching her deal with difficulty without making it a performance. And from all of this watching, over all the years of being a small person who spent most of his time near her, he absorbed something that could not be taught in a classroom. He absorbed the sense that effort was not optional, that difficulty was not a reason to stop, that the world owed you nothing, that you could not find a way to build yourself. He was 5 years old and already sitting at the table with a pencil when she studied. He was 7 years old and already asking questions about things she was reading. He was 8 years old and already the kind of child that teachers mentioned to each other in corridors. Emeka Eze did not know any of this. He was in a large house, managing a growing empire, being called the Alpha King by men who needed to call him something. And his firstborn son was at a table with a pencil, learning how to become the person who would one day come to find him. Not with anger, not with demands, but with something that would prove in the end much harder to refuse. The truth. Documented. Organized. Patient. Just like his mother. Desmond had worked for Emeka Eze for 17 years, when he finally did something with the thoughts he had been carrying for most of that time. He did not do it dramatically. He did not announce it. He simply came in one morning, opened the filing cabinet in the household office where he had kept his records for 11 years, and removed copies of everything he had duplicated, quietly, at the beginning of his tenure. In the way that careful people duplicate important things, he placed them in a folder. He put the folder in a bag. And he left for what would eventually be the last time. He went to see George Adeyemi, whose name he had come across in a way that is not unusual in a city, where certain stories travel between people who work in adjacent spaces, a legal aid lawyer whose name meant something to people who dealt with cases involving the powerful and the less powerful. George's office was what it had always been, underfunded and crowded, and completely organized despite both of these facts. He looked at the folder Desmond placed in front of him, and he read what was inside it. And he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why now?" Desmond said, "Because I am tired." This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, involving a conversation he had recently had with his own daughter, who was now 16, and who had asked him at dinner one evening about something she had read online about a court case, involving a woman who had been held while pregnant, and the way he had been unable to answer her, and had not been able to explain why, and had gone to bed that night with the weight of it sitting squarely on his chest. But tired was true enough. Some kinds of tired are the result of carrying something for too long. Some kinds of tired are the body's way of saying it will no longer participate in what the mind has been arranging. George took the folder. He asked Desmond careful questions. He recorded the answers. He did not use any of it immediately. He was patient with information the way he was patient with everything, waiting for the moment when it would be most effective, most accurately placed. He filed it in a location where it was accessible and protected, and where it waited for the moment that was coming, which he did not yet know the shape of, but which he suspected was not very far away. Meanwhile, in a classroom at the University of Lagos, a young man named Chukwuemeka Okonkwo was 19 years old, and in his first year of law. He had gotten there the way his mother had gotten everywhere, steadily, specifically, one exam at a time. His secondary school results had been exceptional, not in the way that gets loud celebration, but in the way that gets scholarship offers. He had applied for 3, and received 2. He had chosen the University of Lagos because it was the strongest program, and because he had read the faculty list and written down the names of 3 professors he wanted to learn from. He had read a great deal by then. Not only school materials, though he read those thoroughly, but widely, in the particular way that people read when reading, is what you do with every moment that is not already claimed. He had read history, law, literature, journalism. He had read about systems, how they formed, how they failed, how they were rebuilt. He had read about land rights in post-colonial contexts, about wrongful detention, about the particular mechanisms by which power arranges outcomes in its own favor. He had not read these things to understand what had happened to his mother. His mother had told him what happened, plainly, when he was 9 years old, sitting across from each other at the table, as they always sat, with the lamp on one side and their books on the other. She had told him the facts, and she had told them clearly, and she had then said, "I am telling you this so you know it. Not so you carry it the way I carried it. You are allowed to put it down." He had taken the facts. He had not put them entirely down. He was not sure you could entirely put down a thing like that. But he had not let it curdle into something that poisoned him. He had let it become something else, a kind of clarity, a way of seeing the world's arrangements with particular honesty. He studied law because he understood, early and precisely, that the law was where arrangements were either defended or corrected, and he intended to be one of the people doing the correcting. He was a serious student. He was also a human one. He had friends, he laughed easily. He played football on Sunday afternoons with a commitment that his teammates found surprising given how quiet he appeared in other contexts. He had a quality his friends had noticed and commented on, which was that he listened to people the way most people only listen to things they were being tested on. He gave them his full attention, and people felt it, and it made them trust him, and he was trusted widely. In his second year, he joined the law faculty's pro bono clinic, a student-run program that provided basic legal advice and document assistance to people in the community who could not afford a lawyer. He went every Thursday evening. He took his cases as seriously as he took his coursework, which was very seriously, and he sought out the older volunteers and the supervising attorneys and asked them questions until he understood everything he needed to understand. Adaize came to one of his clinic sessions, not as a client but as a visitor. Nkechi, who was by then working in NGO management, had told her about the clinic and suggested she see it. She stood at the back of the room and watched her son sit across from an elderly woman who had questions about a tenancy agreement, and she watched him explain the terms in plain language without making the woman feel talked down to, and she felt the particular, specific pride that is different from all other kinds of pride, the pride of watching a person you made become more than you planned. She did not tell him she was coming that day. She told him she had come when she arrived home. He said, "What did you think?" She said, "I think you are good at it." He said, "I learned from watching you." She said she did not know what he meant. He said, "You always made people feel that their situation mattered. The women at your organization, the people you helped. I watched you do that for years. That is what I was doing tonight." She did not speak for a moment. She went to the kitchen to make tea. From the kitchen, she said, "You are better at it than I am." He said, "I have a better teacher." She came back with the tea. They sat at the table, as they always had, as they had been sitting since he was 5 years old with a pencil in his hand. The lamp was on one side, their cups were on the other. She looked at him, her son, her boy, who was now a young man of 20 who was going to be a lawyer, and who had grown up at this table, and who had made of everything she gave him something she could not have planned or predicted. She thought of the night she had named him. God has done great things. She had said it as an act of will, as a choice, as the only thing available to her in that room. And here he was. She had been right. Emeka Eze, at that precise moment, was at a fundraising dinner in Victoria Island, being thanked by an organization he had donated to for his continued support of community development. He accepted the thanks with the well-practiced grace of a man who had accepted a great many thanks over a great many years. He was 60 years old. He looked good, as men who have lived well tend to look. He shook hands and told a story that made the people around him laugh, and he drove home in his car and went to bed in his large house. He did not dream of anything uncomfortable. He did not know that the document his household manager had placed in a folder and carried to a legal aid office was sitting in a file, waiting. He did not know that his firstborn son was sleeping in an apartment in Lagos, already building the case. He did not know that the girl he had married and accused and never visited in the facility and never written to after, the girl he had reduced to a chapter that was now closed, had, in the intervening years, become someone who ran a women's legal support program and trained paralegals and had just sat across the table from her son drinking tea. He did not know any of it. He slept. He did not dream. And the world continued to build the thing that was coming for him, quietly, as the most certain things tend to build. Chukwuemeka won his first scholarship when he was 17. He was sitting in the small apartment, at the table, when the letter arrived, a single page from a state education foundation, in formal language that took him a moment to fully parse. Then he parsed it. Then he read it again. He put it down. He stood up. He sat back down. He picked it up and read it a third time to make certain he was reading it correctly. He was. Then he stood up again and went to find his mother, who was in the bathroom getting ready for work, and knocked on the door and said through it, "I received the scholarship." There was a pause. Then Adaize said, from behind the door, with the particular evenness she brought to everything, "Which one?" He said, "The foundation one, the full one." Another pause, a longer one. Then the door opened, and she was standing there with a towel around her shoulders, and her face had the expression that was better than celebration, the expression of a person who had known something was true, and was now being told the world had confirmed it. She said, "I knew." He said, "You could not have known." She said, "I knew." He did not argue with this. There are things that people know that are not logical, and are nevertheless correct. And he had grown up in the house of someone whose particular kind of knowing had been reliably right. He was 17 years old and had grown into himself in the way that some young people grow. Not suddenly, not with a dramatic change that people around them noticed and remarked upon, but steadily and thoroughly. The way a tree grows. You look at it every day and it seems the same, and then you look at a photograph from 3 years ago and realize the change was enormous. He was tall, taller than most of the men in his family, which he attributed to the fact that Adese's older brother was also tall, and genes are unpredictable in the specific ways they surface. He was quiet in the way that his mother was quiet, not withdrawn, but contained, in possession of himself in a way that read as confidence without requiring performance. He moved through classrooms and football pitches and social situations with an ease that other young people both respected and, occasionally, found slightly intimidating, until they spoke with him long enough to discover that the ease was not aloofness, but simply comfort with himself. He had his mother's habit of full attention. When he listened with his whole self, and people felt it, and it made them say things to him they did not always say to others. He had developed, over the years of watching his mother study and work and make decisions, a relationship with effort that was not complicated. He did not romanticize struggle. He did not dramatize difficulty. He worked when work was needed. He rested when rest was possible. And he did not spend energy performing either the working or the resting for an audience. This was efficient, and efficiency was something he had observed his mother practice her entire life. His secondary school had been a government school, one of the better ones in their local government area, which meant it was adequately staffed and chronically underfunded, and still, within those constraints, home to several teachers who were excellent, and 2 who were truly exceptional. One of the exceptional ones was a man named Mr. Emeka Duru, a coincidence of first names that Chukwuemeka had noticed and never mentioned, who taught literature and history with a combined passion that did not allow for disinterest. Duru had a way of asking questions in class that made the wrong answer feel like a step toward the right one, and he had recognized in Chukwuemeka, within the first term of his first year, a student who needed to be pushed further than the standard curriculum required. He pushed. Chukwuemeka went. Duru gave him books outside the syllabus. He gave him essays to read and then argued with him about them, which was an education in itself, the experience of having someone take your thinking seriously enough to push back against it. He told Chukwuemeka, in the 3rd year of secondary school, that he was going to be a lawyer, said it as a statement rather than a suggestion. Chukwuemeka had said, "Why?" Duru had said, "Because you understand that words have weight, and because you are not afraid to be in the room where something difficult is being decided." He had thought about that for a long time. The scholarship covered his first year at university and was renewable based on academic performance. He renewed it every year. His grades were consistently at the top of the faculty, not the performative top, where students sacrifice understanding for marks, but the genuine top, where the marks are a side effect of actually knowing the material in a way that is useful and durable. He chose his courses with the same deliberateness with which his mother had always chosen everything. He took evidence law and constitutional law in his first year, because he wanted to understand the foundations before the structure. He took contract law and criminal procedure in his second, because he wanted to understand where things broke down. In his 3rd year he began specializing in civil rights and human rights law, because he had understood, by then, exactly what he was working toward. He did not tell many people what he was working toward. He told his mother, at the table one evening, when he was 20 and in his 2nd year. She listened without interruption, which she always did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The record." He said, "Yes, the record of your detention, and the record of who I am. Both of them should exist correctly." She said, "The paternity." He said, "Yes." She looked at the table. Then she looked up at him. "You are not doing this for me," she said. It was not a question. He said, "I am doing it for the record. The record is wrong. Wrong records hurt people. I am going to be a lawyer who corrects wrong records. It makes sense to start with the one I know best." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "He will not make it easy." He said, "I know." She said, "He has resources you do not have." He said, "I have George." She looked at him. He said, "George Adeyemi. He has been building a file since before I started university." She had not known this. She looked at him with the expression that replaced all other expressions in her face when something genuinely surprised her, a kind of stillness, a pause that indicated recalibration. "George has been building a file," she said. "Since Desmond came to him," Chukwuemeka said. "Desmond is the household manager. He kept records. He came to George when he was ready. He has been ready for a while." Adaeze sat with this. She had not known about Desmond. She had spent years operating without knowing about Desmond, and in that time the evidence had been sitting in a folder in George Adeyemi's organized, underfunded, completely reliable office. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked. He said, "Because I needed you not to carry it. The way you told me I was allowed to put it down. I was trying to let you put it down." She looked at him for a long time. Her son, who was 20 years old and had been, apparently, thinking about all of this for a considerable period of time, and had been doing things about it in the methodical way he did things, and had protected her from knowing while he did it. She thought about the day she had told him the facts, the lamp on one side of the table, his face, 9 years old, listening. She thought about what she had told him. "You are allowed to put it down." He had not put it down. He had put it somewhere else, into a plan, into action, into the kind of careful forward motion that she had always understood as the only real answer to things that had been done to you. He was exactly like her. She had not known how to feel about that until this moment. Now she did. It was not complicated. It was the simple, specific feeling of being known by another person, known in the way that is only possible between two people who have been close enough, long enough, to understand each other without requiring the words. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She said, "Tell me everything." He told her everything. He told her about George's file, about Desmond's records, about the timeline he had constructed, about the specific legal claims he intended to pursue, and the theory of the case and the court he intended to approach. He told her all of it clearly and completely, the way she had always taught him to tell things. She listened with her whole self, the way she had always listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The lamp was between them. The tea was cold. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Nothing you have not already given." She said, "I can give more." He said, "I know, but you have already given everything that matters." She thought, this is what it means to do the work. You do it for 20 years in a room with a lamp and a table, and you think you are only surviving, only getting through, and then one day your child sits across from you and tells you that everything you did was enough, that more than enough, that it built the exact person who was going to do the thing that needed doing. She picked up her cold tea. She drank it. Outside the window, Lagos moved in its usual direction, which was forward and complicated and full of people trying to build things that would last. Inside the apartment, 2 people sat at a table, and the lamp was on between them, and it was enough light for everything that needed to be seen. The pro bono clinic continued to shape him in ways that the formal coursework did not. There is a kind of education that happens only when the stakes are real, when the person across from you has a genuine problem and is relying on you to help solve it, and the theoretical becomes suddenly and irreversibly practical. Chukwuemeka had been in the clinic for nearly 2 years by the time he was a third-year student, and the cases he had handled ranged from straightforward tenancy disputes to complex situations involving employment rights and family law, and in each of them he had discovered something that no lecture could have taught him with the same weight. He had discovered what it meant to feel responsible for a real outcome for a real person. The young man who had come to the clinic with a wrongful termination claim, let down by an employer who had manufactured reasons to let him go because of union organizing activity. The widow who needed to understand a property document she had inherited along with her husband's debts and did not know what she was agreeing to. The young woman from Abeokuta who had not understood a loan agreement she had signed and was now in a cycle of debt that was compounding in ways the lender had made deliberately unclear. Each of these people had sat across from him and looked at him with the particular look of someone who has run out of options and is not sure this one will work either, and he had taken each case with the same methodical attention and found, in each one, the specific thing that could be done, and done it, and watched the look change. That change was what he was in law for. He had understood this clearly by the time he was in his 3rd year, and it had clarified everything else. Why he worked the way he worked. Why he asked the questions he asked. Why he cared about precision in language and documents and arguments, in a way that some of his classmates found excessive. Precision was the difference between a person getting what they were entitled to and not getting it. He had one professor who said this directly, in a first-year lecture that Chukwuemeka had written down and returned to many times. The professor's name was Dr. Io Coker. A woman of about 50 who wore reading glasses and spoke in sentences that were exactly as long as they needed to be. She had said, "The law is a language. Learning it gives you the ability to be heard by the people who make decisions. Without the language, you can be absolutely right and still lose. With it, you can take the truth and make it audible to the system. That is what you are here to learn." Chukwuemeka had underlined those words the day she said them. He looked at them sometimes in the margins of his notebook, where they sat alongside other things he had found precise and true. He spoke to George Adeyemi regularly during his university years. Not about the case always, but about the work generally. George had become a kind of mentor in the way that certain people become mentors not through formal arrangement, but through consistent presence and genuine interest. George would ask him about his coursework. Chukwuemeka would ask George about his cases. They would disagree sometimes about strategy, and the disagreements were productive because both of them were the kind of people who found disagreement useful rather than threatening. In his final year, Chukwuemeka wrote his dissertation on wrongful detention and civil liability, a thorough, detailed, carefully argued piece of work that his supervisor said was one of the better dissertations he had supervised in a decade. The research required him to examine case records, legal precedents, the specific pathways through which false accusations moved through the justice system, and the points at which they could be challenged. He wrote it without once mentioning his mother's case by name. This was deliberate. He was writing about the law, and he wrote about it in the abstract, with the rigor the form required. But he knew, and anyone who read it carefully could have sensed, that the person who had written it was not writing from a comfortable distance. He was writing from inside the knowledge of what these things felt like when they happened to someone who was 23 years old and in handcuffs on a concrete floor. His supervisor gave it the highest mark in the faculty that year. He congratulated Chukwuemeka on the quality of the argument and said he expected to see it published eventually, possibly in revised form. Chukwuemeka thanked him and went home. He told his mother about the mark at dinner. She said, "Good." She did not say more, which was the highest response available to her. She reserved excessive words for situations where they were needed, and a son achieving what you expected him to achieve was not such a situation. He understood this. He had grown up in this language. He sat his bar examinations the following year, after completing the professional law school program. He prepared for them the way he prepared for everything, starting early, covering every area completely, identifying the places where his knowledge was less certain and returning to them until they were not less certain. He slept properly in the days before the examinations, ate properly, exercised on the morning of each exam day. He was not anxious in the way that many people are anxious before examinations of that weight. He was focused, which was a different thing. Focused is what happens when anxiety has been channeled into preparation rather than allowed to become noise. He passed. He was called to the bar on a morning in October, in a ceremony at a hall that was slightly too warm and smelled of the flowers someone had arranged by the stage. Adaeze sat in the third row. She had taken the day off from the NGO, which she had never done for any occasion involving herself. She had done it for this. She watched her son stand with his colleagues and take the oath and receive the certificate that said, in the legal language of the state, that this person was now authorized to practice law, that he had met the requirements and was found competent to speak for people in the rooms where decisions were made. She had been to many important rooms in her life. She had been in the room in the facility. She had been in the visitation room. She had been in the classroom. She had been in the sitting room of the NGO where she now worked, which had helped 73 women in the past 2 years navigate the system that she had navigated alone. She had never been in a room like this one, a room where her son was being formally told that he was now equipped to correct the record. She pressed her hands together in her lap and watched him stand there, and she thought, look what was in that room at 3:44 in the morning. Look what was in those handcuffs, growing, not yet knowing it was growing. Look what that small, loud cry in that cell became. She did not cry at the ceremony. She had cried all the crying she was going to do in a room with a concrete floor, and she had decided somewhere in the 11 months that followed that the tears available to her going forward were going to be for things that deserved them. This deserved something better than tears. This deserved the quiet, complete satisfaction of a person who had decided something was going to be true and had spent 24 years making it true. She stood when the names were called. She clapped, among all the other clapping, for her son. And he found her face in the audience, in the way that people find the one face they are looking for, the way they have always been able to find it, across rooms and years and all the distances that had been placed between them. And he nodded, once, and she nodded back. And that was the whole conversation. It was the right length. The message arrived on a Friday evening in September, while Chukwuemeka was at his desk in the small office he shared with two other junior lawyers at the legal aid organization where he had taken his first position. The organization was not the same one George Adeyemi worked at. George had, over the years, moved into a more senior position at a rights-focused NGO, but it was connected to it, part of the same network of underfunded, overworked, deeply committed organizations that did the legal work that the market would not do, because the market required payment from people who did not have it. His desk was neat. He kept it the way his mother kept things, not obsessively, but deliberately, with the understanding that the arrangement of your workspace was a decision about how you wanted your thinking to be organized. He had a small photograph on the desk, not framed, just propped against his case binder, of himself and his mother, taken by Nkechi at the bar ceremony. He was in his formal court clothes. His mother had her head slightly turned toward him, as though she was about to say something. It was the expression she wore when she was going to say something important. He liked that it was that expression. He liked not knowing what she had been about to say. His friend and colleague Daniel, who sat at the desk closest to the window, had sent him the link without much introduction. The message read only, "Is this him?" Chukwuemeka clicked the link. It opened a digital profile page, long form, well written, published on a business journalism platform that covered prominent figures in the Southeast's commercial sector. The headline said, "A man who built something lasting." The subheading said, "After 3 decades in trade and logistics, Emeka Eze looks at what he has built and what comes next." There was a photograph. A man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, standing in front of what appeared to be one of his properties, a warehouse exterior, though the interior of the image was arranged to feel like an office. He was looking directly at the camera with the particular ease of someone who has been photographed many times and knows exactly what expression to wear. Chukwuemeka looked at the photograph for a long moment. He had not seen a photograph of Emeka Eze before. His mother did not have any, or if she did, she had not kept them in a visible place. He looked at the photograph and tried to find himself in it, the small features of resemblance that biology arranges between parents and children without asking permission. He found some, not the dramatic, obvious kind that people remark on at family gatherings, the subtle kind, the shape of the jaw, the way the brow sat. He read the article fully. He read it the way he read legal documents, not skimming, not looking for highlights, but reading every sentence and noting what each one said and what each one implied. The article spoke about Emeka Eze's business achievements at length. It spoke about his charitable work, the classroom block, several donations to community funds. It spoke about his family. "Father of 5" was the phrase used, and Chukwuemeka read that phrase and held it in his mind, and it quoted Emeka speaking about the importance of legacy. He said, in the article, "What I want people to know when I am gone is that I contributed, that I left things better than I found them." Chukwuemeka read that twice. Then he closed the laptop, put it in his bag, and went to find his mother. She was not at the apartment. He called ahead and she told him to come to the NGO. She was still there finishing a report. He took a bus, then walked the 6 minutes from the stop to the office, which was on the ground floor of a building that also housed a pharmacy and a small printing shop. He knocked on the door. She said, "Come in." She was at her desk with a stack of files on one side and a printed spreadsheet on the other, annotating something in her careful, clear handwriting. She looked up when he came in, read his face in the way she read everything, quickly, thoroughly, and said, "Sit." He sat in the chair across from her desk. He put his phone on the desk between them, with the article open. She looked at it. She picked it up. She read the first few lines, then scrolled through the rest. He watched her face while she read. She read with the same expression she brought to everything, focused, neutral, neither revealing more nor concealing more than the situation required. She read the whole article. When she put the phone down, she looked at the desk for a moment. Then she looked up. "What do you want to do?" she said. Not, "What are you feeling?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not any of the natural human responses to the particular strangeness of this moment. She asked the practical question, because she was a practical person, and she understood that her son was a practical person, and that what they both needed right now was to be practical together. He said, "I want the record corrected, nothing more." She looked at him. "His name is not on any record of your detention," she said. "His name is not on my record anywhere." "I know," he said. "I want it on mine." She understood. He did not want retribution, did not want money, did not want the public destruction of a man he had never met. He wanted the official record to acknowledge the truth, that Adaeze Okonkwo had been wrongfully detained, that the charge against her had been fabricated, and that the child born to her during that detention was the biological son of Emeka Eze, who had filed the charge, who had never come, who had continued his life as though none of it had happened. He wanted the gap between the public story, father of 5, philanthropist, man who builds things, and the true story to exist in the same place where it could be seen. She said, "It will not be simple." He said, "I know." She said, "He will fight it." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are prepared for that?" He said, "I have been prepared for it for a long time." She looked at him for a long moment. The office was quiet. Through the door she could hear the faint sound of the pharmacy next door, the murmur of customers, the ordinary business of a neighborhood going about its evening. She thought about the 11 months in the facility. She thought about walking out of the gate with 200 naira. She thought about the room in Mushin, the yellow walls, the scholarship letter, the bar ceremony, the photograph on his desk. She thought about 24 years of everything. She thought about the thing he was planning to do, to stand in a court and present the truth and ask the court to acknowledge it, to make the record say what the record was supposed to say. She thought about the risk of that, not only to him but to her, the attention it would bring, the history it would surface, the scrutiny. She was not afraid of scrutiny. She had spent 11 months in a place where people with authority had looked at her situation and decided it did not matter, and that had burned the fear of scrutiny out of her completely. What people thought of her situation was less important than what the situation actually was. What the situation actually was this. Her son was a lawyer. He had the file. He had the records. He had George, and George had Desmond's documents, and Desmond's documents contained the dates that could not be reconciled with the fabricated paperwork, and the law had mechanisms for this, and her son knew those mechanisms in the way that good lawyers know them, not as abstract rules but as living tools. She said, "Then go and do it correctly." He said, "I will." She said, "You will need George." He said, "I have already spoken to George." She looked at him again, the slight, adjusting look of someone who has just realized that the conversation they thought they were beginning has, in fact, already been in progress. "When?" she said. "Last month," he said. "I went to see him. He has been waiting. He said he would wait as long as I needed, that the file was secure. He has been holding it for 3 years." She pressed her hands together on the desk. She looked at them. She thought about George, who had been a young lawyer with an old briefcase when she had first sat across from him in the visitation room, and who was now a senior lawyer with a rights organization and a record of wins that was longer than most people knew about because many of his wins did not attract celebration. She thought about all the people who had been holding pieces of this, quietly, in their different positions, waiting. "He has been waiting," she said. 3 years, Chukwuemeka said. She said, "He is a good man." He said, "Yes." She looked at her son. The lamp on her desk made the same quality of light that the lamp at home made, warm, direct, casting everything it touched into clarity. She said, "I want you to understand something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Whatever happens, whether the record is corrected or it is not, whether the court agrees or it does not, whether this goes as you have planned or it goes differently, you have already done the most important thing." He said, "What is that?" She said, "You became someone who can do this. That was the work. The case is just the case. The work was you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did the work." She said, "We did it at the same table." He nodded. She nodded. Then she closed her files, put her pen down and said, "Let us go home. You can tell me everything on the way." They walked out into the street together, and the evening was warm the way Lagos evenings are warm. The kind of warmth that stays in the air long after the sun has gone, that the city holds in its concrete and its noise and its sheer mass of living people, a warmth that is not comfortable exactly, but is completely, undeniably alive. And they walked, the way they had always walked through things, together, forward, not looking back. The filing would come. But first, the walk home. George Adeyemi's office had grown, in the way of organizations that proved their value. It now occupied the full first floor of a building in Yaba, with 8 permanent staff and a volunteer program that brought in law students 3 days a week. The photocopier worked reliably. There were 2 rooms that could hold confidential client meetings simultaneously. The filing system was digital now, though George maintained paper backups of everything significant, a habit he had formed in the years when the digital was less reliable and had never been able to stop. The file he had been holding for 3 years was in both digital, organized, indexed, physical, in a labeled folder in a cabinet marked with a code only George and his senior associate understood. When Chukwuemeka came to the meeting, this was a proper meeting, scheduled, with George's senior associate also present, a sharp woman named Adaora who handled the civil rights cases. George placed the physical folder on the table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have been waiting for you to be ready." Chukwuemeka said, "I am ready." George said, "You understand that his lawyers will be well-resourced." Chukwuemeka said, "Yes." George said, "And you understand that this will take time, even with everything we have." Chukwuemeka said, "I understand time." George looked at him and recognized something, not just the quality of the mother and the son, which was visible and expected, but something additional, something that was the product of 24 years of preparation. He recognized the particular steadiness of a person who has decided something completely, and who is therefore not going to be moved by obstacles, not because they are unaware of the obstacles but because they have already accounted for them. He had seen this quality before. He had seen it in Adaeze, sitting in the visitation room all those years ago, asking him not how long but when. He had seen it in the women who came to his organization after years of struggling through systems that were not designed with them in mind, and who arrived not broken but clear about what they needed and why. He said, "Then let us begin." The preparation took 4 months. 4 months of Chukwuemeka and Adaora and George working through the documents systematically. The original arrest records, the fabricated financial documents with their impossible dates, Desmond's comprehensive household records which showed the real state of the accounts during the period in question, the facility records including the birth log in the guard's handwriting. The DNA testing had been arranged through a specialist clinic. The results were formal, documented, and admissible. They were building something that needed to be airtight, not because the truth was complicated, the truth was actually quite simple, but because the person on the other side had resources that could make simple truths into extended complications if the case was not constructed perfectly. Chukwuemeka drafted and revised his arguments with the same quality of attention he had given everything since he was 5 years old at a table with a pencil. He read every precedent George gave him. He asked Adaora to challenge his reasoning at every step, to find the weakest point in every argument and push at it, because the opposing lawyers were going to do exactly that, and he needed to have already found the weakness before they did. Adaora found him excellent to work with. She told George, privately, that the young man argued the way the best lawyers argued, not by insisting he was right, but by being genuinely interested in whether he was right, which was different and much harder. The petition was filed on a Tuesday morning in a Lagos civil court. Chukwuemeka filed it himself, physically, because it was his case, and he had decided that was the right thing to do. He walked in, submitted the documents to the clerk, received the filing confirmation, and walked back out into the morning. He texted his mother, "Filed." She replied, "Good." That was all. On the other side of the city, in the building that housed the law firm retained by Emeka Eze's interests, a paralegal eventually brought the petition to the attention of the partner in charge of Eze's portfolio. The partner read the heading. He read the petitioner's name. He read the claims. He called Emeka Eze's main number. Emeka was in a meeting. He stepped out to take the call. He listened. The partner said, "There is a civil petition filed this morning. It concerns the wrongful detention of a woman named Adaeze Okonkwo, in a case from approximately 24 years ago. The petition also includes a paternity declaration and DNA filing." Emeka said nothing for a moment. The partner continued, "The petitioner is identified as Chukwuemeka Okonkwo. He is represented by the Adeyemi Rights and Justice Organization." Emeka said, "How strong is it?" The partner said, "I have not reviewed the full filing yet. I will have a complete assessment by tomorrow." Emeka said, "Get me the assessment." Then he went back into the meeting. He sat through the rest of the meeting with the particular surface-level composure of a man who has had decades of practice at keeping his face calm when the situation underneath it is not calm. He answered questions. He made decisions. He agreed to a contract term that someone proposed. He did none of it with his full attention, because his full attention was in a place he had not visited in 24 years, in the memory of a thing he had done, a decision he had set in motion, a door he had closed so thoroughly and so long ago that he had nearly believed it was a wall. It was not a wall. It had never been a wall. It was a door, and someone had just opened it. By the next morning, when the partner's assessment arrived, Emeka Eze understood several things that he had not fully understood before. He understood that the documents his people had produced at the time were, apparently, flawed, in a way that a competent lawyer had found and documented comprehensively. He understood that the household records from that period, records kept by Desmond, who had been loyal for 17 years, and had then, quietly and without announcement, become something else, were now in the possession of the opposing party. He understood that the DNA evidence was formal and certified, and not going to be successfully challenged. He sat with this for several hours. Then he called his partner back and said, "File the motions." He said it the way people say things they know are delay tactics, not solutions. He knew the case was solid. He had known, in the first moments after the partner's call, that the case was solid, because the thing that made it solid was the same thing that had made him confident in his original arrangement. The truth was the truth, and eventually the truth is the only thing that is still standing. He had counted on the truth being something he could manage. He had managed it for 24 years. He had not counted on it arriving in a civil court, argued by his own firstborn son, supported by the household records of the man he had trusted most. He filed the motions. They were denied. He filed again, denied again. The third time, the judge's tone in her written decision made it plain that the court's patience was limited. Emeka sat in his office on the evening of the third denial and looked out the window at a city that was going about its business in the usual way, and he thought, for the first time in a very long time, about a room with a concrete floor. He thought about what he knew of that room. Not much. He had not asked. He had not wanted to know. He thought about a boy being born in it, in the early hours of a Monday morning, and being given a name. He thought about the name. He had read it in the petition documents. Chukwu Emeka, God has done great things. He sat with that for a long time. He was 62 years old. He had built something real. He had also done something wrong in a way that he had been able to avoid fully examining for 2 decades, and now it was in a court document, and the court document was going to become a record, and the record was going to exist in the same world as everything else he had built. He thought about the speech he had given at the classroom block opening. He thought about what he had said about legacy. He thought, what you leave behind includes what you did, not only what you gave. He had known this. Somewhere. He had always known it. He had just managed, for a very long time, not to look at it. He was looking at it now. And what he saw was not something that motions could make go away. The courtroom was room 14 of the Lagos Civil Court. It was a room that smelled of files and floor polish, and the particular dense quality of air that gathers in rooms where serious things have been decided for many years. The ceiling was high. The benches were wood, worn smooth by decades of people sitting forward to hear what was being said. The windows were tall, but the light through them was the particular filtered light of a building that had stood long enough to have acquired a patina, the way old buildings acquire patinas, the way rooms that have held important things acquire a kind of gravity. Honorable Justice Chinwe Adichie Nwosu had presided over this court for 9 years. She was known, by both the lawyers who appeared before her and the clerks who worked with her, for 2 qualities that she had apparently possessed in equal measure her entire career. She was patient, and she was thorough. She let arguments be made fully. She asked questions that cut to the center of things. She read every document she was given, and she was known to be capable of quoting, from memory, the exact line in a submission where a lawyer had made a claim they later tried to walk back. She was not the kind of judge who was impressed by resources or reputation, or the confidence of a well-dressed legal team. She was the kind of judge who was impressed by evidence. George Adeyemi had spent 9 years appearing before her in various capacities. He trusted her. He did not say this often, because trust in this context was a professional assessment, not a personal feeling, and he did not want to give the impression that he was relying on anything other than the strength of the case. But he had made the assessment clearly. This judge would look at the facts, and the facts were on their side. Chukwu Emeka had reviewed everything the judge had written, her published decisions, which were more detailed than many judges' decisions, as though she wrote them for the record in the fullest sense of the word, for the people who came after as much as for the parties in front of her. He had read them the way he read everything, thoroughly, looking for patterns, for the way she thought about evidence and claims and the relationship between them. He had found a judge who believed that the truth of a document was more important than its appearance, and that when appearances and truth conflicted, the job of the court was to find the truth. This was exactly the kind of judge he needed. Emeka Eze's legal team was led by a senior partner named Bar Olawale, who was gray-templed and confident in the way of senior lawyers who have argued in important rooms for many years and have learned that confidence itself can function as a weapon. It can make the other side feel the case is already decided before the arguments begin. He had a junior beside him who handled the documents, and a paralegal behind him who handled the supplies. Chukwu Emeka sat at the opposite table with George on his left and Adaora on his right. His briefcase was open. His documents were in order. His notes were brief. He did not need extensive notes, because he had built the argument from the inside out, from the facts upward. and he knew it well enough that the notes were only for the moments when precision of wording mattered most. He had been to this courtroom before, on other cases. He had stood at this bench and made arguments on behalf of other people, and he had gotten good enough at it that other lawyers had taken notice. But this was the first time he had stood there for himself, or for the version of himself that was the record, the official account of who he was and where he had come from. He was calm. Calm in the way that is not the absence of feeling but the management of it, the ability to hold feeling somewhere useful rather than somewhere that interferes with thinking. When Justice Adichie Nwosu entered, the room stood. She sat. The room sat. She looked at the papers in front of her for a moment, then at the two tables. She said, "This is the matter of Chukwuemeka Okonkwo versus the state, with civil petition regarding the detention of Adaeze Okonkwo and accompanying paternity declaration. Counsel for the petitioner." Chukwuemeka stood. He said his name. He said who he represented. He said, "My lord, I appear for the petitioner in this matter." She nodded. She looked at the other table. Bar. Olawale stood and gave his details. She said, "We will begin with the petitioner's primary submission on the wrongful detention." Chukwuemeka stood again. He began. He did not begin with drama. He did not begin with an emotional statement about the circumstances of his birth, or the years his mother had spent rebuilding her life. He began with a document, the original arrest warrant, dated to a Wednesday morning 24 years ago, and he walked the court through it, line by line, establishing the baseline. Then he introduced the financial documents that had been used as evidence for the charge. He introduced them calmly, acknowledged their existence, and then, in the same calm voice, introduced Desmond's household records from the same period. He walked the court through the dates. He pointed to the transaction record that bore a date 2 weeks after Adaeze's arrest. He noted that on the date of that alleged transaction, Adaeze Okonkwo had been in custody in the facility. He produced the custody record proving this, the signing-in document from the day of her arrest, the date and time stamped by the facility officer on duty. Then he paused. He said, "A woman cannot make a financial transaction from inside a detention cell. The date on this document places it 2 weeks after her intake. This is not a minor inconsistency. This is the document falling apart under its own terms." Bar. Olawale objected. He called it an oversimplification. Justice Adichie Nwosu looked at him for a moment. She said, "I will hear your response to the specific date discrepancy in your rebuttal. Please let counsel for the petitioner continue." Chukwuemeka continued. He walked through each piece of evidence in turn, not hurrying, not laboring, placing each one in its position in the argument the way you place objects on a shelf, deliberately, with the clear understanding of what belongs where and why. He presented Desmond's full set of records, which showed the actual state of household accounts during the period in question. Steady, documented, consistent, with no irregularities and no missing amounts that corresponded to the charge. He presented the testimony of a forensic document examiner, provided in written form and available for questioning, who had analyzed the fabricated records and identified the specific markers of recent production in documents that were claimed to be from 24 years ago. Paper composition, ink properties, the particular characteristics of printing technology that had not existed at the claimed time of the document's creation. Then he presented the facility birth log. He placed it under the court's attention with particular care. He read the relevant entry into the record, the date, the time, the name of the guard, and the notation that had been made about the mother's condition. He did not editorialize. He simply read it. He let it sit in the room and be itself. Justice Adichie Nwosu wrote something down. She wrote several things down. Bar. Olawale's rebuttal was competent. He challenged the document examiner's methodology. He questioned the chain of custody on Desmond's records. He questioned whether Desmond, having left his employment under circumstances that were, he noted, still under review, was a reliable source. These were not bad arguments. They were the arguments available to him. Chukwuemeka's response to each was specific, technical, and grounded in the evidence he had prepared. He had anticipated every challenge. The chain of custody was documented at each step, and he produced that documentation. The document examiner's methodology was peer-reviewed and consistent with standards accepted in the court's jurisdiction, and he cited the specific cases. Desmond's departure from employment was voluntary and preceded any legal proceedings by 3 years, which eliminated the suggestion of interested motivation. He answered Bar. Olawale's questions the way he answered everything, completely, without emotion, with the clarity that comes from knowing your ground. When it was over, the arguments made, the evidence submitted, the court's questions answered, Justice Adichie Nwosu said she would reserve judgment and deliver her decision in writing within 30 days. 30 days. Chukwuemeka sat down. George was beside him. He did not allow himself to calculate probabilities. He had learned, in his years at the clinic and at the organization, that the period after a hearing was the period where anxiety lived if you allowed it to, and that the best response to that period was the same as the best response to any period of waiting. Work. Do the next thing. Go to the next case. Let the court's time be the court's time. He packed his documents into his briefcase. He stood. He shook George's hand. He shook Adaora's hand. He walked out of room 14 of the Lagos Civil Court and into the corridor, which was full of the ordinary activity of a building full of cases and filings and the complicated, perpetual business of people trying to resolve the things that needed resolving. He called his mother. She picked up after one ring. She said, "How did it go?" He said, "We made every argument. Everything we prepared, we put in front of the court." She said, "And the judge?" He said, "She listened. She wrote things down. She will decide in 30 days. She said, "Okay." He said, "I am going back to the office." She said, "I know. I will see you tonight." He said, "Yes." He put the phone in his pocket and walked out of the building and stood for a moment on the steps, in the particular heat of a Lagos midday, which does not ask permission and does not moderate for the occasion. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. He let the sun be what it was. He thought nothing in particular, or nothing that was fully formed, just the quality of thought that follows significant effort, which is less like thinking and more like the mind settling after being used hard. Then he walked down the steps and went back to work. The 30 days were going to pass either way. The question of how they passed was up to him. He chose the same way he had chosen everything since he was 5 years old at a table with a pencil. Forward, methodically, one thing at a time. It was the only way he knew. It was also, as it happened, the best way. Some people are taught this. Some people absorb it from being close to someone who simply is it. He had been close to such a person his entire life, at every table, in every conversation, in every demonstration of what discipline looked like in practice. He walked back to the office. The 30 days began. The 30 days were the longest Adaeze had felt since the 11 months in the facility. She would not have said this to her son, because it would have been the kind of thing that placed weight on him, and she had spent 24 years trying to be careful about what weight she placed on him, and what she carried separately. But they were long days. She went to work. She handled cases at the NGO. They had 40 active cases across the support program. Women at various stages of legal proceedings or recovery from wrongful situations, and each case demanded attention. She gave it. She had always been able to give her professional attention to the thing in front of her and keep the things that were personal in a separate compartment, not because she was cold but because she was organized, and she had learned that the compartments were necessary for function. You could not help someone with their situation if you were in the middle of your own situation at the same time. She helped. She listened. She made calls. She reviewed documents. She trained the 2 newer paralegals in her program, both of whom were former clients and both of whom were excellent, and training them was one of the particular pleasures of her work, watching people move from the position of needing help to the position of providing it. In the evenings she came home and cooked something real and ate it at the table. She read. She called Nkechi, who had moved to Abuja several years earlier for her job, but with whom she maintained the twice-weekly calls that had been part of her life for so long that interrupting them would have felt like removing something structural. Nkechi asked about the case. Adaeze told her what she knew, which was what Chukwuemeka told her, which was what the court had. Nkechi said, "He is going to win." Adaeze said, "We do not know yet." Nkechi said, "I know." Adaeze thought, Nkechi has always had the confident version of certainty, the kind that arrives before the evidence. She had been right many times, she had also been wrong, but in general, over the course of their friendship, her confident certainties had a better track record than most people's careful calculations. She said, "I hope you are right." Nkechi said, "I am always right. You know this." Adaeze smiled. She held the phone against her shoulder and looked across the room at the window, which was showing a portion of the evening sky, which was the particular color of Lagos evenings, a violet gray, that the city's lights would slowly replace over the next hour. She thought, "I have looked at a lot of windows and waited for what is on the other side of time." She knew how to do this. She had been doing it for most of her adult life. On the 28th day, Justice Adichie Nwosu's written decision was filed. Chukwuemeka received the notification from the court. He called George before he opened it. George said to open it. He opened it. The decision was 22 pages. Formal, detailed, citing each piece of evidence and each argument and each applicable legal precedent. He read it the way he read everything, all 22 pages, in order. The ruling was in the petitioner's favor on all primary claims. The court found that the charge against Adaeze Okonkwo had been supported by fabricated documentation, and that this was evidenced by the date discrepancies, the forensic analysis of the documents, and the countervailing household records. It found that the wrongful detention had been a material harm, and entered it officially into the civil record. It ordered that the original detention record be annotated to reflect the finding of wrongful basis, so that the record, wherever it existed, would carry the correction alongside the original entry. On the paternity declaration, the court accepted the DNA evidence and the documented circumstances, and entered the finding that Chukwuemeka Okonkwo was the biological son of Emeka Eze, born during the unlawful detention of his mother, and that this fact was a matter of legal record. There was a section in the decision, paragraph 17, that Chukwuemeka read twice. In it, Justice Adichie Nwosu wrote about the facility birth log. She quoted it directly into the decision. She wrote that the notation in that log, the date, the time, the guard's handwriting, was one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, because it made the truth immediate and specific, not abstract. She wrote that official records existed to capture the truth of events, and that when they captured something this particular, they carried a weight that the court was obligated to acknowledge. She wrote, "The petitioner's mother gave birth to him at 3:44 in the morning, in conditions of wrongful detention. This fact is now part of the legal record, where it should have been from the beginning." Chukwuemeka read that paragraph. Then he called George. He read the opening of paragraph 17 aloud over the phone. George said nothing for a moment. Then George said, "We won." Chukwuemeka said, "We won." George said, "All of it?" Chukwuemeka said, "All of it." George made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he said, "Go tell your mother." Chukwuemeka put down the phone and sat still for a moment. His desk was in front of him, neat, the photograph of him and his mother leaning against the case binder. In the photograph, she had her head slightly turned, about to say something. He picked up the photograph and looked at it. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, left his office and went to find her. She was at the NGO. She was always at the NGO at this time of day, working. He knocked on the door. She said, "Come in." He came in. He placed the decision on her desk, opened to page 1, and said, "Read it." She looked at him first. She read his face, 24 years of reading his face, every expression he had ever had, and whatever she found there made her reach for the paper before he finished speaking. She read. She read all 22 pages. He stood and waited, because he knew she was going to read all 22 pages and there was no point suggesting she go to the conclusion. She would get there in her own order. She reached paragraph 17. He watched her slow down. She read it more than once. He could see her eyes moving back to the beginning of it. Then she put the paper down. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at her desk, at the surface of it, the way she looked at surfaces when something had arrived and she was organizing herself to receive it. Then she looked up. He had never, in 24 years, seen her face do exactly what it did in that moment. It was not crying, though her eyes had changed. It was something more complete than that, the expression of a person who has been holding something for so long that when it is finally confirmed, the confirmation moves through the whole body at once, and the face can only hold a portion of it. She said, "Paragraph 17. He said, "Yes." She said, "She wrote it into the record." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. She pressed her hands flat on the desk the way she pressed her hands flat on things when she was grounding herself, which was a thing she had been doing for as long as he could remember, as long as he had been watching her manage difficult moments by pressing her hands to a surface and finding her feet. He moved around the desk. He did not say anything. He stood beside her and put one hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that for a moment. The window in her office showed the same portion of street it always showed, the pedestrians, the buildings, the ordinary afternoon. Nothing had changed outside. Everything had changed in the room. After a while she said, "Your mother gave birth at 3:44 in the morning, in conditions of wrongful detention. This fact is now part of the legal record, where it should have been from the beginning." He recognized it. Paragraph 17. She had memorized it. She had read it twice and it was already inside her. She said, "That is me." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is officially me. On the record." He said, "On the record." She stood up. She was a woman of 47, and she stood with the posture of someone who had been carrying something and had just set it down. Not the slumped posture of relief, but the taller posture of someone whose load has changed. She said, "Let us go home." He said, "Yes." She picked up her bag. She picked up the decision, folded it carefully, put it in her bag. Then she went to the door, and he followed her out, and they walked together into the street, into the afternoon, into the ordinary living world that had no idea anything significant had just happened in a room on the ground floor of a building that also housed a pharmacy and a printing shop. But something had. Something that had been missing from the record for 24 years was now there. And the record was, from this moment, correct. It would remain correct. Records of this kind do not change again. The decision was a civil finding, a clarification of record. It was not a criminal conviction, not a public announcement, not the kind of thing that travels through the city on the back of sensation. It traveled differently. The first person outside the case to read it was a journalist named Raymond, who covered civil rights and social justice matters for a small but respected publication based in Lagos. Raymond had a contact at the court who sometimes flagged decisions worth reading, not because anything improper passed between them, but because the contact believed that good decisions that said something true about how the law should work, deserved to be seen by people who could write about them clearly. Raymond read the decision on a Friday afternoon. He read it through twice. Then he called Chukwuemeka, whose contact information appeared on the filing as counsel for the petitioner. Chukwuemeka took the call. He was careful with Raymond, the way he was careful with everything, not evasive but deliberate. He confirmed the facts that were in the public record. He explained the legal claims in plain language. He said, when Raymond asked about his personal role, "I am the petitioner. I am also the child born in the facility. I am a lawyer." The case was about correcting a record that was wrong. Raymond asked if he would say more about what it meant to him personally. Chukwuemeka said, "I think paragraph 17 says what needs to be said." Raymond published the piece on his organization's website the following week. It was not a long piece. It was clear and factual, citing the decision directly, explaining who was involved and what had been found. It was the kind of journalism that is better than it is dramatic, detailed enough to be true, organized enough to be understood. A blogger in Bonny Island picked it up and ran a summary. Then a larger Lagos outlet ran a full article. Having found the decision through the original piece and confirmed the details, the article included the name of the respondent, because the respondent was a matter of public record. The name was Emeka Eze. By the end of that week, the name Emeka Eze appeared in several places online in contexts that were new. Not the philanthropist headlines, not the businessman profiles, but in connection with a court decision finding that a woman had been wrongfully detained, and that the man who had filed the false complaint was now identified in a legal record as the father of the child she had delivered in that detention. Paragraph 17 had been quoted in 3 separate publications by the end of the first week. Each time it appeared in full, because it was the kind of paragraph that could not be paraphrased without losing something essential. Emeka's household phone rang many times that week. His business line rang. Several people who worked with him, or whose organizations had professional relationships with him, called to ask questions. These were not hostile calls. Mostly, they were the calls of people who had been associated with someone and wanted to understand what the association now meant, whether it changed anything, whether they needed to think differently about the things they had built with him. One of the board members of the community foundation that had administered his classroom block donation called. The call was brief and professional, and ended with the board member saying that the board would be in discussion. 2 of Emeka's business partners called. These calls were longer, and what was said in them was not recorded, but what came after them was. 2 contract discussions that had been in progress were quietly moved to a lower pace, to a holding pattern, to the kind of indefinite consideration that in business language means no. His eldest daughter by Caroline, his first wife, a woman named Ifeoma who was 33 and worked in banking, and had long since built her own life at a considerable emotional distance from her father's household, texted him a single message. It said, "I read it." He did not reply for 2 days. When he did, he sent, "I know." She did not respond. Chisom, the 4th wife, left on a Thursday. She did not announce it dramatically. She simply organized herself and her children over the course of a week, with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about it for longer than the past few days. And on a Thursday morning she was gone. She sent him a message from her sister's house that was formal and final and contained no accusations, which was, in some ways, harder than accusations would have been. The name removal petition from his hometown, the request to take his name off the classroom block, gained signatures quickly. A local chairman of a community group started it. It reached 300 signatures within 5 days. The school's board met to discuss it. Emeka watched this from the same position he had always operated from, at the center of his life, in the large house, surrounded by the things he had built. But the center did not feel the same. The center was the same place, but something about what surrounded it had changed, and change in that direction was not reversible by any of the tools he had always used. He had always been able to manage outcomes. He had managed outcomes his entire adult life, in business, in relationships, in the particular art of being a prominent person in a community that both needed and resented powerful men. He had managed outcomes by having resources and using them, by having relationships and invoking them, by understanding what people wanted and being strategic about providing it. He could not manage this outcome. It was not manageable in those terms. It was in the public record and in the court's decision and in paragraph 17, and it was not going anywhere. He sat one evening in the living room of the large house, the room that had always been for him the center of his domain, the proof of what he had built, and he looked at the room and thought about it differently than he had thought about it before. He had built it. That was true. The resources were real, the ability was real, the decades of work were real. But sitting in the room now, he could see clearly, with the clarity that arrives when the arrangements you have made are no longer working to protect you from your own history, that what he had built was incomplete. It was the kind of structure that was large and impressive and had a wall missing, and had always had a wall missing, and the wall that was missing was the accounting, the reckoning. He had never reckoned with it. He had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had done, and what it had cost the people it cost, and what that meant about who he was. He was 62 years old, and he was sitting in his house, and thinking about a woman who had given birth in a detention cell, because of a decision he had made. He was thinking about a boy, a man now, a lawyer now, who had filed a petition not from anger, but from a commitment to the truth, who had argued it with evidence and patience and thoroughness, who had won, because he was right, and because the judge was the kind of judge who recognized rightness and put it in the record. He was thinking about paragraph 17, which he had read the day after the decision was filed, which he had read in the manner of a man reading a document that describes him accurately for the first time, recognizing the truth in it, which is different from being surprised by it. He was not surprised. He had known it was all true. He had always known. He had simply not arranged himself to face it. He faced it now, sitting in the quiet room, with the house around him, with the generator running because the power had gone, with the ordinary sounds of a large household going about its evening in the background. He faced it. He had done something wrong, not by accident, not from ignorance, not from the kind of error that is forgivable because it came from the wrong information. He had made a decision that he knew was unjust, and he had made it for his own convenience, and a woman had paid for it, and a child had been born in the middle of the payment, and the child had grown up and come back to the court with the truth organized in his hands. And the court had said, "This is the truth. It is now in the record. It will remain. This could not be managed. It could not be arranged into a different shape. It was simply what it was." He sat with that for a very long time. He did not sleep well. He had not slept well since the first call from the lawyer. But this was a different kind of not sleeping, not the sleep of someone who is managing a problem, but the sleeplessness of someone who has stopped managing and is simply in the presence of the thing they have been avoiding. On the 9th day after the decision was published, his assistant came to him with the messages that had accumulated. He read through them. He responded to some. He set others aside. Then he called his personal phone and asked for the number of the legal aid organization where Chukwuemeka worked. His assistant found it. He wrote it on a piece of paper. He put the paper in his jacket pocket. He left it there for 2 days. On the 11th day, he picked up the phone and dialed. He asked to speak to Chukwuemeka Okonkwo. The person who answered said that Chukwuemeka was in a meeting. They asked who was calling. He said his name. There was a brief pause on the line. Then the person said they would take a message. He said, "Tell him I would like to meet. At his convenience, wherever he chooses." He gave his number. Then he put the phone down and sat with the quiet that followed. It was a different kind of quiet from anything he had sat with before. Not the quiet of confidence, not the quiet of management, not the quiet of a man who had arranged things in his favor and was resting in the arrangement. It was the quiet of someone who has put something down, not the burden exactly, because burdens do not go away by being acknowledged, but something. The weight of not having said what needed to be said for 24 years. He had said it now, or the beginning of it. He had picked up the phone. He did not know what would happen next. For the first time in a very long time, he did not know, and he was not trying to arrange it so that he would. He sat in the large house, in the evening light, and he waited. For once, he simply waited. The message reached Chukwuemeka at 3:20 on a Tuesday afternoon. He came out of his meeting to find it written on a yellow note on his desk, in the handwriting of the organization's receptionist. Emeka Eze called, wishes to meet at your convenience. Left number. He stood at his desk and read it twice. Then he sat down. He put the note in the center of the desk where he could see it. He looked at it for several minutes without doing anything in particular. He had known this call might come. He had not planned for it in any specific way, because there were only so many things you could plan for, and he had been focused on the case. But he had known it was a possibility, had held it, somewhere at the edge of his thinking, as a thing that might happen after the decision. He had not thought through what he would do if it did. He picked up the phone and called his mother. She picked up after 2 rings. He said, he called. She said, when? He said, while I was in a meeting. He left a message. He wants to meet. She was quiet. He said, what do you think? She said, I think the question is what you think. He said, I am asking you. She said, why? He said, because you are my mother and this concerns you more than it concerns me. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the slight sounds of her office in the background, the phone on the desk, the distant sound of the street through her window. She said, it concerns us both, but you are the one he has called. Whatever you decide to do, you should decide it for yourself, not for me. He said, what would you do? Another pause, longer this time. She said, I would meet him, not because he deserves the meeting, because you deserve to be in the room with the man who fathered you and hear whatever he has to say. You have been in every room that mattered. This is a room that matters. He was quiet. She said, he is not going to give you anything you have not already given yourself. The record is corrected. Everything you needed from the law you have. This meeting is different. This meeting is something else. He said, what? She said, a chance for him to be in the room with the truth in person. Whether he takes it properly is up to him. But the chance is real, and you should give it, because you are the kind of person who gives it. He thought about that. He said, I will meet him. She said, good. He said, do you want to know what he says? She said, tell me afterward. But meet him first, just you. This is between you. He called Emeka Eze's number from the note. He rang twice before it was answered by Emeka himself, which was not what Chukwuemeka had expected. He had expected an assistant, a layer, the management of access that powerful men use. Emeka picked up on the second ring and said, yes. Chukwuemeka said, this is Chukwuemeka Okonkwo. You left a message. A pause. Emeka said, yes, I did. Thank you for calling back. Chukwuemeka said, you wanted to meet. Emeka said, if you are willing. Chukwuemeka said, I am willing. On one condition. Emeka said, name it. Chukwuemeka said, we meet somewhere that is mine. My organization, my building, my ground. Not a restaurant, not your office, not neutral territory. Mine. A pause. Emeka said, agreed. Chukwuemeka said, next Thursday at 2 o'clock. Emeka said, I will be there. He gave the address and ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he opened the case he had been working on before the meeting, pulled it in front of him, and continued working. This was how he handled things. You decide, and then you do the next thing, and the thing you have decided becomes real by being placed in time. Thursday came. Emeka Eze arrived at 12 minutes to 2. Chukwuemeka watched him walk through the door from behind the glass of the conference room, a large man, older than Chukwuemeka had imagined from the photograph in the article, which had been taken at a distance and in favorable light. In person he was heavier, and the gray at his temples was more extensive, and he moved slightly more carefully than the photograph suggested, the careful movement of a man whose joints had begun to register the decades. He was wearing a plain dark suit, no ornament, no emblem of status. He had come, as far as Chukwuemeka could see, without an assistant or a lawyer. Chukwuemeka went out to the reception area himself. He did not send someone else. He walked out, and he stood in front of Emeka Eze, and for a moment, both of them simply looked at each other. It was a strange thing, to look at a person for the first time who had been the source of so much of everything. Chukwuemeka had thought about this before the meeting and had decided that he was not going to analyze his feelings about it in the moment, that the moment required him to be present and functional rather than introspective. He would analyze it later, if there was anything to analyze. He said, follow me. He led Emeka to the conference room. It was a plain room, a table, chairs, a whiteboard with notes from a previous meeting still visible on it. He had deliberately chosen not to erase the whiteboard, because the notes were from a real case and the room was a real working space, and he wanted Emeka to understand he was visiting a place where real things happened. They sat across from each other. Chukwuemeka had placed a glass of water on the table for each of them. Emeka looked at the table. He looked at the water. He seemed to be organizing himself internally, the way people organize themselves when they have prepared words, and are now finding that the room is different from what they prepared for. Then, he looked up. He said, "I am sorry. I want to say that first, before anything else. Not because it is going to solve anything or change what happened, because it is true, and I have not said it, and not saying it has been wrong." Chukwuemeka said nothing. He listened. Emeka said, "What I did was wrong. What I set in motion, the accusation, the arrest, not coming, never coming, all of it was wrong. I have not let myself sit with that fully until very recently. I have been good at not sitting with things." He paused. He looked at the table again, then back up. He said, "Your mother carried what I should have carried. You grew up without things you should have had, because of my decision. I am not going to ask you to forgive me. I am not sure that is something I am entitled to ask." He was quiet. Chukwuemeka said, "Why did you come?" Emeka said, "Because I wanted to be in the room with you. Because you have been in the right rooms all along, and it was time I came to one of them." Chukwuemeka looked at him. He said, "My mother told me once that the question she asks herself when something has happened that she cannot change is, what can I do with what remains? She has built her whole life on the answer to that question." Emeka was quiet. Chukwuemeka said, "I am not going to tell you what to do with what remains. That is your work. But I want you to understand what has been built, not so you can take any credit for it, but because you should know what your choices cost, and also what was made in spite of them." He told him, not emotionally, not dramatically, but plainly, in the way his mother told things, with precision and without performance. He told him about the apartment, about the scholarship, about the table and the lamp and the evening classes. He told him about the bar ceremony. He told him about the pro bono clinic, about the 73 women his mother's program had helped. He told him about the case, which Emeka already knew, but he told him what was behind the case, the years of preparation, the file George had been holding, the care with which everything had been built. He told him all of it. He took approximately 20 minutes. When he finished, Emeka Eze looked at him and said, "She raised a man of honor." Chukwuemeka said, "Yes, she did." Emeka said, "Out of what I left her with." Chukwuemeka said, "Out of what she had, which was herself. You did not leave her with anything. She had herself already." Emeka was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything I can do? Not to make it right. I understand I cannot make it right. Is there anything that would help?" Chukwuemeka said, "The record is already corrected. That was what I came for." Emeka said, "Your mother's organization." Chukwuemeka said nothing. Emeka said, "I am not trying to buy anything. I am asking whether a contribution to the organization she runs would be used for the work it does." Chukwuemeka said, "That would be a decision my mother makes. You should speak to her." Emeka said, "Will she speak to me?" Chukwuemeka said, "I do not know. That is for her to decide." Emeka nodded. They sat in the conference room for a moment more. Two people in a plain room with water on the table and notes on the whiteboard and the ordinary afternoon sounds of the building around them. Then Chukwuemeka stood. Emeka stood. They did not shake hands. Chukwuemeka had not decided in advance what gesture, if any, was appropriate for this particular ending, and he found that when the moment came, no gesture was required. They simply stood in the room together, and then Chukwuemeka walked to the door and opened it, and Emeka Eze walked through it. Chukwuemeka watched him walk down the corridor and through the main door and out into the afternoon. Then he went back to the conference room. He sat for a moment. He drank some of the water. He looked at the whiteboard with the notes from the previous meeting. He thought, that is done. Not resolved, not healed, not made comfortable or complete, but done, in the sense that a thing you have decided to do and have done is done. He sat for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. She picked up after one ring. He said, "He came." She said, "How was it?" He said he was sorry. I believe he meant it. She was quiet. He said, "He wants to speak to you. Whether to contribute to the organization." He said, "It is your decision." She said, "I will think about it." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am all right." He said, "I will come tonight." She said, "Yes, come. I will make something." He said, "Okay." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to his desk and opened the case he had been working on. The case involved a woman in Enugu whose employer had terminated her contract in a manner that the documentation did not support. He read where he had left off. He made a note. He continued. The afternoon moved forward in the way that afternoons move. Steadily, without drama, 1 minute behind the next. Outside, Lagos did what it always did. Inside the small, plainly furnished organization where the work happened, a lawyer sat at his desk and did the work. The way his mother had always taught him. The way it was always going to end. Adaize thought about Emeka's request for a week before she made a decision. She thought about it in the way she thought about everything important, not constantly, not by turning it over and over until it was worn smooth, but by returning to it at intervals, looking at it from different directions, and then putting it aside until the next time. This was the way she had learned to make decisions under conditions that were not ideal, and there had been many such conditions in her life, and the method had been reliable. She did not discuss it with Nkechi immediately, which surprised Nkechi when she found out, because discussing things with Nkechi was usually one of the first steps. But this particular thing she needed to be alone with for a while, because it concerned a part of her history that she had carried alone for so long, that sharing it even with Nkechi still required a particular kind of readiness. She discussed it with herself, which was not a self-indulgent thing but a practical one, a conversation between the part of her that felt something about Emeka Eze and the part that was trying to decide correctly. What she felt, at the bottom of everything, was this: she did not hate him. She had expected to, at some point in the 24 years, had expected that the accumulated evidence of what he had done would eventually become hatred, the clean, simple kind that makes things easier because it removes ambiguity. But it had not become that. What it was instead was something more complicated, a clear assessment of a wrong that had been done, combined with the absence of a connection to the person who had done it that would have made hatred natural. Hatred requires some kind of bond. You hate people you were bound to, in some way, and the bond has been violated. She had never been bound to Emeka Eze. She had been arranged with him, which was different. She had spent less than a year in a household where he was present, and the presence had been the kind of presence that did not form bonds, intermittent, distracted, treating her as one of several arrangements in his life rather than as a person he was choosing. So there was no bond to violate. There was only a wrong, clearly understood, documented and corrected, and the man who had done it asking if he could contribute to a cause that helped women who had been through the kind of wrong he had done. She thought about the women in her program. She thought about them specifically, by name, in the way she thought about all her cases, not as a category but as people. The woman who had come to the program after 2 years in the courts fighting a wrongful arrest related to a property dispute her late husband's family had initiated. The young woman from Ogun who had been unable to afford the legal support she needed to contest a charge that had followed her from one city to the next and prevented her from being employed. The woman who had found the program through a referral from a clinic and had been in a state of such exhaustion when she arrived that the first thing she needed before anything legal was simply someone to make her tea and sit with her while she found her words. The program helped them. It helped them specifically and practically, with people and time and knowledge and the particular kind of attention that came from everyone in the program having, in some way, been where these women were. The program was chronically underfunded. The NGO as a whole was chronically underfunded because the work it did served people who could not pay for it, and the organizations that funded such work were themselves stretched in a dozen directions. Every 6 months there was a funding conversation, and the conversation was always the same. Not enough, never enough, but let us see what we can do. A significant contribution from Emeka Eze would help, materially, practically, in the way that money helps when it is used for the right things. It would fund paralegals. It would fund travel costs for women who needed to reach the courts but could not afford the fare. It would fund the small things that were not small at all: the tea, the chairs, the staff hours spent sitting with someone who needed to find their words. She thought about all of this carefully. Then she thought about what accepting the money would mean, not what it would look like to anyone outside. She was not particularly concerned with that, having spent a long time operating below the radar of public opinion and finding it an acceptable place to work. She thought about what it would mean to her, inside, in the part of her that had to live with her decisions. It would mean that she was taking something from a situation that had tried to take everything from her. It would mean turning what had been done to her into fuel for something that helped other people in similar situations. It would mean that Emeka Eze's money, generated over decades of work that was real even if the man was complicated, would go toward the work of correcting the kinds of injustices he had participated in. There was a version of her younger self that would have had trouble accepting that. The girl who had been taken from her family and brought to a stranger's house and then arrested on false charges. That girl had a wound that took years to become something more useful than a wound. But she was not that girl anymore. She was a 47-year-old woman who ran a program that had helped 73 people and was working on case number 74. She called Emeka Eze on a Thursday morning from her office after she had cleared her schedule for the first hour. He answered on the second ring, the same way Chukwuemeka had said he answered, directly, without a layer. She said, "This is Adaeze Okonkwo." A long pause. The kind of pause that holds a great deal. He said, "Thank you for calling." She said, "I am going to speak plainly, because plain speaking is how I operate." He said, "Please." She said, "I have thought about your offer. I have thought about what the organization needs and what it does, and what the money would be used for. I have decided to accept it, with conditions." He said, "Name them." She said, "The contribution is to the organization, not to me. It is to be used for the legal support program specifically. There will be no naming of rooms or programs in connection with your name. The contribution will be recorded in the organization's books as an anonymous donor gift, and you will be identified internally by a reference code. You will not be given any form of credit, public or private, that connects your name to this organization or this work." Emeka said, "I understand." She said, "I am not interested in rehabilitating your reputation. I am interested in helping people who need help. If you want to contribute to that, the conditions I have described are the only way this happens." He said, "I accept the conditions." She said, "Good." There was a pause. Then he said, "Is there anything you want to say to me? Not about the contribution, anything." She considered this. She looked at the wall of her office, the wall with the small framed photographs, the certificates, the handwritten notes from former clients that she had kept because some things deserve to be kept. She said, "I want to say one thing." He said, "Tell me." She said, "My son is a remarkable person. He is remarkable because of what he chose to do with what he was given. What he was given was a concrete floor, and a mother who decided he was going to be all right. He took that and built something with it that I could not have predicted and that I am not able to find the right words for." She paused. "You should know that," she said, "not because it changes anything about what you did, or about what I went through, or about the record, but because you asked if there was anything I wanted to say, and that is what I want to say. Your son, whom you never came for, is someone worth knowing." Emeka said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different from how it had been at the beginning of the call. Something in it had moved. He said, "He told me the same thing, in different words." She said, "Yes, that is how we raised him, to tell people what is true." Another pause. She said, "I will have our finance team contact your office about the process for the contribution." He said, "I will make sure everything is ready on our end." She said, "Good." She ended the call. She sat in the quiet office for a moment. She looked at the photographs on the wall. She looked at the notes from former clients. She thought about what the contribution would fund, the specific things, the travel costs, the paralegals, the chair in the waiting room that needed replacing. She thought about what she had said to Emeka about her son. She thought about whether she had said the right thing. She decided she had. It was true, and it was honest, and it gave him something that was genuinely worth having. Not forgiveness, which was not hers to give on a schedule, and not absolution, which was not available, but information, real information about the consequence of what he had done, which was not only the suffering, the courts had documented that, but the life that had been built inside the suffering, which was also, in its own way, his to know about. She picked up her phone and called Nkechi. Nkechi picked up and said, "You have been very quiet about everything." Adaeze said, "I know, I am ready to talk now." Nkechi said, "Tell me everything." Adaeze told her everything. She started from the court decision and went through the meeting her son had described to her, and through her own phone call, and through the decision she had made about the contribution. She told it the way she told everything, clearly, in the right order, without dramatizing. When she finished, Nkechi was quiet for a moment. Then Nkechi said, "The money goes to the program." Adaeze said, "The money goes to the program." Nkechi said, "He gets no credit." Adaeze said, "No credit." Nkechi said, "And you are all right with this?" Adaeze said, "I am all right with this." Nkechi said, "Then I think you did the right thing." Adaeze said, "So do I." Nkechi said, "You always do." Adaeze said, "Not always." Nkechi said, "More than anyone I know." Adaeze thought about this. She said, "I have had a long time to practice." Nkechi said, "You have." They talked for another 30 minutes, about other things. Nkechi's job in Abuja, her daughter who was now in secondary school, A problem with a colleague that she needed advice on. Ordinary things. The ongoing texture of two friends' lives, continuing alongside the significant things and not being diminished by them. After the call, Adeze stood up and went to the window and looked at the street. The afternoon was at that particular angle where the shadows were long and the light was golden, and Lagos looked, for the hour before the evening traffic changed everything, like a city that was doing something right. She looked at it for a while. She thought about the first morning after the facility, the window in Ikena's apartment, the street coming to life. She thought about the morning she had moved into the room in Mushin. She thought about the yellow walls. She thought about the bar ceremony and the photograph on her son's desk. She thought about a guard's handwriting and a time, 3:44, and what it meant now that those numbers were in a court decision, in the legal record, permanent. She thought about what her son had built from those numbers, what she had built, what they had built together at a table with a lamp. She was not finished. She would not be finished for a long time. There were still cases, still women who needed the work she was doing, still things that needed to be corrected and documented and argued in front of people who could make it official. But she was also, in this moment, someone who had arrived somewhere. Not at an ending. She did not believe in endings, not the kind that close things off, but at a place where you can turn around for a moment and look at the distance you have crossed and let it be what it is. She had crossed a long distance. She turned back to her desk. She had work to do. She sat down and did it. The weeks following the phone call were quieter than the weeks before it. This was the nature of the period after a significant thing. Not anticlimactic, but genuinely quieter. The way the air is quieter after rain. The noise had been the approach, the building, the case, the filing, the hearing, the 30 days, the decision, the publications, the calls and consequences. The noise had been Emeka Eze's name appearing in places it had not appeared before, connected to things it had not been connected to. The noise had been the board meeting about the classroom block, the contract discussions that went quiet, the people who called and the people who did not. All of that was still happening, in various ways, in the world outside. The case was still in the record. Paragraph 17 was still there. The classroom block board had issued a statement saying they were reviewing the naming. The business conversations that had gone quiet had not resumed. But inside the apartments and offices where Adeze and Chukwuemeka lived and worked, the quiet had arrived. Chukwuemeka threw himself back into his caseload with the particular energy that arrives after a long concentration on one thing, the relief of returning to many things, the sense that the world is large and full of work and the work is good. He took 3 new cases in the 2 weeks following the meeting with Emeka Eze, all pro bono, all complex, all the kind of cases that required exactly the combination of thoroughness and patience that he had spent his whole life developing. The case he was most invested in was a wrongful termination matter involving a woman from Enugu named Clara, who had been employed by a logistics firm for 9 years and dismissed in a way that violated her contract terms, with documentation that the firm had backdated to make the dismissal appear procedurally correct. The parallels to his mother's case were not lost on him, though he did not mention them to Clara, because the parallels were his private observation and not something that belonged in the professional relationship. He worked on Clara's case with the same thoroughness he had worked on his own. He filed carefully. He argued carefully. The first hearing produced a partial success, an order for discovery that gave him access to the firm's internal communications during the period of the dismissal. Those internal communications, when he received them and reviewed them, were exactly what he had suspected they would be. They told a different story than the official documents. They showed the real sequence of events, the real reasons for the dismissal, the specific decision points and the specific people involved. He organized the communications into the argument. He prepared for the next hearing. This was his life. Case by case, document by document, one person at a time. He was 25 years old and he was doing what he had decided he would do when he was 20, and sitting at the table telling his mother his plan. And the doing of it was exactly what he had expected it to be. Hard, and specific, and deeply satisfying, in the particular way that work you are built for is satisfying. He was also, in the weeks after everything, processing the meeting with Emeka Eze. He had told his mother he believed Emeka meant the apology. He still believed that. He had read People his whole life, and the quality of Emeka's delivery, the lack of performance in it, the absence of the smooth confidence he had clearly deployed in 1,000 other rooms, suggested a man who was saying something true rather than strategic. But believing the apology was sincere was not the same as knowing what to do with it. He had not been certain what he expected from the meeting, and the meeting had not given him something simple enough to place in a clear category. It had given him a real person in a plain room, older than he expected and carrying something he had not been carrying lightly, saying sorry in a way that was real but could not be sufficient, and he had received it, and responded to it, and walked out of the room without knowing entirely what it meant to have done so. He was not distressed by this uncertainty. He had grown up in the care of a woman who was comfortable with things being unresolved, who could look at a situation that would not close cleanly and say, "It is what it is, now what do we do with it?" He had absorbed that comfort with open endings, and he applied it here. The meeting had happened. He had given Emeka Eze something he needed, which was the chance to be in the room with the truth in person. Whether Emeka made something of it was Emeka's business. Chukwuemeka's business was the work, and the work continued. George came to the organization for lunch one Friday, about a month after the decision. He brought groundnut soup from a place he had been buying lunch from for 12 years, and they ate at the small table in the kitchen off the main office. George said, looking at the food rather than at Chukwuemeka, "How are you?" Chukwuemeka said, "I am well." George said, "The case." Chukwuemeka said, "I think about it sometimes, not in the way I expected." George said, "What way did you expect?" Chukwuemeka said, "I expected to feel completed, like something was finished." George said, "And it is not finished?" Chukwuemeka said, "Nothing is finished, it is corrected. That is different." George considered this. He said, "It is the right distinction." Chukwuemeka said, "She taught me that. She never said things were finished. She said, 'What do we do next?'" George said, "She is still doing that." Chukwuemeka said, "Every day." They ate for a moment without talking. Then George said, "You are good at this work, you know that." Chukwuemeka said, "I know." George said, "Not just good. You have something I have seen in very few lawyers. You are not in it for what it does for you. You are in it for what it does." Chukwuemeka said, "The women in my mother's program, she is the same way." George said, "Yes, she is." Chukwuemeka said, "It is not virtue exactly. It is just how we see it. The work is the point, the win is part of the work, but the work is the point." George said, "Most people do not figure that out. Some people figure it out eventually. Very few people come in already knowing it." Chukwuemeka said, "I had a long education." George smiled. He said, "A table and a lamp." Chukwuemeka looked at him. "She told you that?" George said, "She mentioned it once, years ago, early on. She said she studied every evening, and that you watched, and that watching was how you learned." Chukwuemeka said, "She was teaching me without calling it that." George said, "The best teachers always are." They finished their lunch. George packed the containers. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. He said, "What Desmond did, coming to me, holding those records, you know that took something." Chukwuemeka said, "I know." George said, "He carried it for a long time before he could do it." Chukwuemeka said, "Have you spoken to him since?" George said, "Once. He is fine. He has a different job now. He seemed, when I spoke to him, like someone who had put something down." Chukwuemeka said, "I know that feeling." George said, "Yes, I imagine you do." He left. Chukwuemeka went back to his desk. He opened Clara's file. He read his notes from the previous session. He picked up his pen and continued. That evening, he went to his mother's apartment for dinner. They ate at the table. The same table, a different apartment but the same arrangement, the same quality of light from the lamp, the same two people who had been eating at this configuration of table and lamp for 20 years. She had made rice and stew. She had made it from scratch, the way she made everything from scratch, because she had decided long ago that convenience food was fine for certain things but not for evenings that deserved real cooking. They ate and talked about ordinary things. Her cases, his cases, and Nkechi's news from Abuja, a documentary one of them had watched. Normal conversation. The conversation of two people who are in each other's lives enough that the significant things exist alongside the ordinary ones, and none of it requires special marking. After dinner she poured tea. She set his cup across from hers. She said, "I spoke to the finance team today about the contribution." He said, "And?" She said, "It will be processed next week. The program will have enough to run the travel support for the next 18 months without another funding appeal." He said, "Good." She said, "Yes." They drank their tea. He said, "Are you glad you accepted it?" She considered the question. She turned her cup slightly on the table, a habit she had when she was thinking, which he had watched for 20 years. She said, "I am glad the program has what it needs. Whether I am glad I accepted it from him specifically, I am still working out how I feel about that. But the program has what it needs." That is the part that matters most. He said, you put the useful thing ahead of the uncomfortable feeling. She said, I always have. He said, I know. She looked at him across the lamp. She said, are you all right after the meeting? He said, I am all right. I did not know what I was expecting. I did not get what I expected, because I did not know what I expected. But I am all right. She said, he is a person who did a wrong thing, and then spent 24 years not facing it, and then faced it. He said, yes. She said, people can do that. It does not undo the wrong, but it is still something. He said, yes. She said, you gave him the chance. He said, you told me to. She said, I told you it was yours to give. You decided to give it. He said, I think it was the right decision. She said, so do I. They sat for a while longer. The lamp made its usual light. The apartment was quiet. The street outside was doing what streets do at 9 o'clock in Lagos. Still alive, still noisy, but at a different frequency from the afternoon, with the particular sound of a city that never fully stops but does shift down a register at night. Eventually she stood and took the cups to the kitchen. He stood and put his jacket on. At the door he said, I will come Sunday. She said, come Sunday. I will cook. He said, good. He left. She listened to his footsteps in the stairwell, the particular rhythm of them, quick and even, the same rhythm since he was a child, and then the door of the building, and then silence. She went back to the table. She sat down. She looked at the lamp. She thought about 24 years at tables with lamps. She thought about the first table, which had been the floor of a cell, and the lamp which had been a dim fixture in a concrete ceiling, and the things that had been built since then. She thought, there is still work to do. There was always still work to do. This was not a troubling thought. It was the thought she went to sleep with every night and woke up with every morning, and it was as comfortable as a familiar room. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. She was ready for it. There is a case file in the offices of the Adeyemi Rights and Justice Organization that carries the reference number assigned to it when it was first opened, before there was a case, before there was a hearing, before there was a paragraph 17. It was opened as a collection of documents held in trust, a file of potential future use, and it sat for 3 years being exactly that, potential. The file is now closed, resolved, archived, but it exists. This is the thing about records, which was also the thing that the case was about. They exist. You cannot unmake them. You cannot close the door on them and have them stop being what they are. They sit in systems, in courts, in archives, in the organized cabinets of careful lawyers, in the institutional memory of facilities and governments, and the machinery of official life. And they are there, waiting, for as long as the thing they record matters. The record of Adaeze Okonkwo's wrongful detention is in a court decision that also contains paragraph 17. The decision is in the database of the Lagos Civil Court, and in the organization's files, and in the National Legal Information System, where court decisions are stored. It is findable by anyone who knows how to look. Paragraph 17 says what it says. It says it in the formal, specific language of a court decision, which is a language that has weight because of the institution behind it, because of the process that produced it, because of the judge who wrote it, after reading everything and deciding what the truth was. The record of Chukwuemeka Okonkwo's identity, his name, his parentage, his place of birth and the circumstance in which he was born, is also in the decision. It is also in his own record, the paternity declaration that is now formal and certified and part of the legal landscape of his life. He does not use the other name. He has not changed anything. He is Chukwuemeka Okonkwo, his mother's son, her name on his name, her discipline in his work. The declaration is for the record. The record needed to be right. He made it right. And then he went back to work. That is, in some ways, the whole story, the going back to work. The understanding that the significant thing, once done, becomes simply done, and the next thing is the next thing. But it is not the whole story. The whole story includes what happens after. Clara won her case. The wrongful termination judgment came on a Monday morning, 4 months after the first hearing, and it was clear and specific, and required the firm to compensate her for the termination and restore her employment record. Chukwuemeka read the judgment in his office and called her. She cried when he told her, not loudly. She was a contained person, as he had observed across their months of working together, but the kind of crying that is unmistakable. The crying that says this was important, and I was afraid, and it went the right way. He said, "You did the work. You brought the information. You held everything correctly through a long process. She said, you did the arguing. He said, that is what I am here for. The arguing is my part. The holding is yours. You held. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you. He said, you are welcome. He put down the phone and allowed himself, for a brief moment, the particular feeling that was the point of the work. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud a word for what it was. It was more like alignment, the sense that the thing that needed to happen had happened, that the world had moved, in a small and specific way, from less correct to more correct. He let himself feel it for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he opened the next file. Adaize's program marked a milestone in the autumn. The 75th person who had come through the legal support program completed her case successfully and returned to tell Adaize in person. The woman's name was Amaka, and she was 41. And she had come to the program 18 months earlier, in a situation that had seemed, at the time, intractable. A combination of a disputed property matter and a related family law issue that had been tangled together in a way that appeared designed to defeat her. The program had helped her untangle it, not all at once, not without difficulty, but step by step, with 2 of the trained paralegals working alongside her, and with Adaize herself taking the most complex elements of the legal argument and driving them forward. Amaka came to the office on a Thursday morning with a wrapped package. She put it on Adaize's desk. She said, I did not know what to bring. This is not enough, but I wanted to bring something. Adaize opened the package. It was a small, framed piece of embroidery, a pattern in red and green, geometric, careful. She said, I made it. Adaize looked at it. She said, it is beautiful. Amaka said, you are the one who said to me, the first day I came, that the situation was solvable. You said it like you were absolutely certain. Adaize said, I was. Amaka said, I did not believe you. Adaize said, I know. I have said it to enough people to know when someone does not believe it. It does not matter whether you believe it at the beginning. Amaka said, what matters? Adaize said, that we start. She put the embroidery on the wall, in the space between 2 of the other framed things. It fit there as though the space had been waiting. She took a photograph of the wall and sent it to Nkechi. Nkechi replied with a voice message, which was how Nkechi communicated when she felt something that required more than text. The voice message said, this is what it looks like when you build something with your life. I am looking at this photograph and I am telling you that this wall is everything you ever did on one wall. Adaize listened to the message twice. Then she sent back a short text. Come visit. I will cook. Nkechi sent back, name the weekend. They found the weekend. Nkechi came from Abuja on a Saturday morning, and they spent the day doing the things they had been doing together since they were in the same polytechnic class 20 years ago. Talking without stopping, cooking something that required more pots than the kitchen had space for, sitting at the table until later than was sensible and continuing to talk. Chukwuemeka came in the evening. He and Nkechi had a particular relationship, not quite aunt and nephew, because the formal term was wrong, but something in the direction of it, built over 2 decades of proximity. He called her Auntie Nkechi, which she had told him was not necessary, and which he had continued doing because the formality of it amused them both. He ate with them. He sat at the table. He told Nkechi about Clara's case. Nkechi told him about her work in Abuja, about a policy change she was trying to push through the organization she now managed. They argued about something, a strategic disagreement about the correct approach to a type of legal advocacy, a genuine disagreement between 2 people who thought carefully about these things and had different but close positions. The argument was productive. Neither of them shifted fully, but both of them said things during it that the other would think about later. Adaize listened and did not say very much. In the particular way she sometimes did not say much when the conversation was good, and her role was to be present in it rather than to direct it. She looked at the table around which this was happening, her son and her friend and the food she had cooked and the lamp between them, and she thought, look at this. Look at what there is. Not in a self-congratulatory way, not as though she was standing outside the scene looking in. She was inside it, fully and completely. She was the person who had made this possible by making choices, one after the other, for 24 years, and the scene was the result of the choices. It was good to know that. It was important to let herself know that. Emeka Eze, by the autumn, had spoken publicly once, not in a major venue, not in a national publication. He had given an interview to a regional outlet, a small thing, in which he said he had done something wrong in his life that he was not able to undo, and that he was trying, in the ways available to him, to respond to it with his actions going forward. He did not name Adaize. He did not name Chukwuemeka. He said only that the people affected knew who they were and that he hoped his actions would speak more clearly than he was capable of speaking. Adaize read the interview. She read it once, put it down, and did not read it again. She did not call him. There was no reason to call him. The contribution was being used as agreed. The conditions she had named were being honored. The record was what it was. The classroom block in his hometown went through its process. The board's review, the petition, the public discussion that these things generate in small communities, where everyone knows everyone and positions are not simple. It ended with a compromise. The building remained. The name was removed from the exterior, and a new plaque was installed with the names of all the community members who had contributed smaller amounts over the years, which turned out to be many people, none of whose names had previously appeared anywhere on the building. The building was better for it. The contribution of many was more accurately represented than the credit of one. George Adeyemi continued his work. He had, by the autumn, passed 50, and people sometimes asked him, at events, at conferences, in the corridors of the courts where he had spent his career, whether he was considering doing something different, moving to private practice, writing, teaching. He said he was where he needed to be. He said it without drama. He meant it. He sometimes thought about the file he had held for 3 years. He thought about the day Desmond had walked in with the folder, and the conversation they had had, and the look on Desmond's face, the look of a man putting something down that had been heavy for a long time. He thought about the day Chukwuemeka had come to his office and said he was ready. He thought about the hearing, and Justice Adichie Nwosu, and paragraph 17. He thought about these things the way you think about things that went correctly, not with satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction was too passive a word for it. With recognition, with the sense that something that needed to happen had happened, and that his part in it had been the right use of his time. Desmond was living in Ibadan. He had a job there, managing the accounts for a medium-sized manufacturing firm. He was good at it. He spoke to George occasionally, not often. On one of the occasions he called, he said, "Is it done?" George said, "It is done." Desmond said, "Good." That was the conversation. In December, the NGO held its annual event, a gathering of everyone who had worked with the program over the year, including former clients who wanted to come, including the paralegals and volunteers and the small staff. It was held in the organization's main meeting room, which was not large enough and required people to stand along the walls, which happened every year. Adaize spoke. She did not speak long, because she was not a person who spoke long when shorter served. She thanked the people in the room. She said the work was real and the need was real, and the only thing that made the need smaller was doing the work. She said, "We have 75 people who came through this program and are on the other side of what brought them here. We are going to have 76, then more. And the number will keep growing as long as we are here and doing this." She looked at the room. She said, "That is enough." She meant it. Afterward, Chukwuemeka found her at the edge of the room with a cup of tea. He stood beside her. They watched the room, the conversations, the former clients talking to the current ones, the paralegals explaining things to the volunteers, the particular energy of a room full of people who have survived something and are talking to other people who are surviving something, which produces a specific quality of community that is unlike other communities. He said, "What you built here." She said, "What we built." He said, "You started it. You did the first thing." She said, "I went to work. That is the first thing. It is also the last thing. It is all the things in between." He said, "I know." She said, "So do you." They stood together in the room that was too full and too warm, and completely right, and they drank their tea, and the conversations around them rose and fell. This is what Adaize Okonkwo is today, a woman of 47, with a diploma and a record she earned, and a son she raised, and a program she runs, and 75 people on the other side of the thing that brought them to her door. This is what Chukwuemeka Okonkwo is today, a lawyer at 25 who took his first pro bono case the week after he was called to the bar, and has not stopped taking them since, who sits across from people who need help and listens to them with the quality of attention that his mother gave him as a model for as long as he can remember. This is what the legal record says: wrongful detention, no conviction. Born at 344, the conditions of birth as documented in the guard's handwriting, the paternity acknowledged, the record corrected. This is what paragraph 17 says, in the formal language of a court. The petitioner's mother gave birth to him at 3:44 in the morning, in conditions of wrongful detention. This fact is now part of the legal record, where it should have been from the beginning. It is there. It will remain. No one is going to change it. And in the meantime, in the apartment, with the lamp on the table and the tea going cold while they talk, in the offices where the work continues, in the courts where cases are argued and decisions are made and records are corrected. In all of those places, every day, two people continue to do the thing they have always done. The work. One case at a time. One person at a time. One truth at a time. The way it was always going to end. The way it was always going to begin again. The things that last are never the things that announce themselves. Emeka Eze had announced himself. He had announced himself at every event, in every newspaper profile, at every ceremony where someone handed him a microphone and waited to hear what he would say. He had been the Alpha King, which is a title that requires performance. It must be maintained in the presence of other people, renewed by the reactions of the room, fed by the particular energy of being seen and recognized and deferred to. Adaeze Okonkwo had never been announced. She had simply continued. She had continued while in the facility. She had continued when she left. She had continued through the rooms in Mushin, and the yellow walls and the examination hall, and the Polytechnic, and the evenings at Nkechi's kitchen table. She had continued when she found the NGO and when she built the program and when the program began to produce results and when the results turned into a wall of photographs and certificates and one small piece of embroidery in red and green that a woman named Amaka had made by hand. She had not stopped to be announced. This was not modesty in the conventional sense. Modesty implies that you have suppressed the desire for recognition, that you are aware of what is not being celebrated and have chosen not to celebrate it. Adaeze did not experience it that way. She simply did not have the time or the interest. The work was the work. The work was what was real. The being seen for the work was pleasant when it happened, and not particularly meaningful when it did not. What was meaningful was the result. The 75th person walking out of the building with their situation changed. The paralegal who had been a client 2 years ago and was now sitting across from someone new, listening with the quality of attention she had once needed from others. The phone call from George saying, "We won." The text from her son saying filed. The moment in a conference room when a judge's written decision was placed in front of her, and she read paragraph 17, and the world rearranged itself slightly. These were the meaningful things. She kept them all. Not always literally. The moment in the conference room was not a physical object, not something she could put on a shelf, but she kept it in the sense that she did not let it go. She carried it with the same care she had always carried the important things, which was firmly and without display. She also kept the ones that had not gone well. There had been cases that did not win. There had been clients who had gone through the program and encountered outcomes that were not what they hoped for, outcomes that were technically correct and practically difficult, and that required a kind of support that went beyond the legal. She had provided that support. She had sat with people in the space after loss the same way Mama Bose had sat with her in the facility, without trying to change the thing, simply being present while it was what it was. These had shaped her too. The losses were part of the education. The ongoing education that did not end at any particular point, but continued for as long as you were paying attention. She was always paying attention. In January of the following year, the program received a request from a university lecturer, a woman who taught social work and was developing a curriculum module on women's legal support systems. The lecturer, whose name was Dr. Yemisi, wanted to visit the program, understand its structure, and potentially interview Adaeze for the curriculum materials. Adaeze said yes. Dr. Yemisi came on a Wednesday morning. She was organized and thoughtful and had read everything publicly available about the program before she came. She asked good questions. She asked about the intake process, about how cases were assessed, about the training program for the paralegals, about the partnership with the legal aid organizations. She asked about what had worked and what had not. Adaeze answered all of it. She was used to being asked about the program's structure. She had given similar conversations to donors, to other NGOs, to journalists who were writing about legal aid. The structure was a thing she could explain clearly. At the end of the formal conversation, Dr. Yemisi looked at her notes for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, "Can I ask something that is not about the program's structure?" Adaeze said, "Ask." She said, "Everything I have read suggests that this program came out of your own experience with the justice system. Is that something you are willing to speak about?" Adaeze considered the question. She had been asked versions of it before, not often, because she did not place herself at the center of the program's public narrative, but occasionally, by people who had done enough research to understand that the organization's founding was connected to something personal. She said, "Yes, I will speak about it." She told Dr. Yemisi the same story she had told Chukwuemeka at the kitchen table 24 years ago. The facts, in order, without softening. She told her about the facility. She told her about the charge and the documents and the lawyer who had found the error and the 11 months and the morning she walked out of the gate with 200 naira. She told her about Chukwuemeka. She told her about the table and the lamp. She told her about the examination results and the polytechnic and the room in Mushin and the yellow walls. She told her about the case, because the case was now public record and therefore hers to tell. She did not tell her about the call from Emeka Eze, or the decision she had made about the contribution. That was still in the category of things that were private, not because they were secret, but because they had not yet found the form in which they were ready to be shared. Dr. Yemisi listened. She did not take notes, Adeze noticed, during this part of the conversation. She had put down her pen when Adeze began, and she did not pick it up. When Adeze finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want people to take from that story?" Adeze thought about it. She said, "I want people to understand that the system fails people, and that failing people does not end people, that you can be failed by every mechanism that was supposed to protect you, and still build something real. Not in spite of being failed, not as some kind of lesson in resilience, which is a word I find too comfortable when applied to the kind of experience I am describing, but alongside it. The failing and the building happen in the same life. They are both real, and the building does not require the failing to have a meaning. It does not need to have been for something. It can simply have happened, and the building happens too, because you decided it would." Dr. Yemisi wrote one thing down. Then she looked up and said, "Can I quote that?" Adaize said, "Yes." It appeared in the curriculum materials the following semester, attributed to her with her permission. It appeared in the section of the module dealing with resilience, the word she had said she found too comfortable, which was now being used to introduce a more complicated understanding of what that word should mean. She found out about it when one of the students in the course sent her a message, a young woman who was studying to be a social worker, and had come across the program through the curriculum, and had written to ask if she could volunteer. Adeze read the message. She replied, "Yes, come on a Wednesday." The young woman came. She was 22, with the particular seriousness of someone who has decided on her vocation and is ready to start. Adeze spent an hour with her on the first day, explaining the program, showing her the intake process, introducing her to the 2 paralegals who would be her supervisors during the volunteering period. Then she sent her to sit with one of the paralegals for the rest of the day, to observe, to listen, to start learning the way you start learning, by being in the room. At the end of the day, the young woman came back and said, "This is what I want to do." Adaize said, "Then you are in the right place." The young woman said, "Did you always know this was what you wanted?" Adaize said, "No, I knew it when I was doing it." The young woman nodded. She said, "How do you know if you are doing the right thing?" Adase said, "You look at whether it is useful, whether it is honest, whether it makes something better, even slightly, and then you do more of it." The young woman nodded again. She seemed to be filing this. She came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that, and the one after that. This was also how the work grew. Not by announcement but by continuation. One Wednesday at a time. One person who came back. Chukwuemeka took on a new case in February, a case involving a young man in Abia whose employment situation had been complicated by a false criminal record, a record that had been generated in circumstances the young man claimed and the evidence suggested were wrongful. It was the kind of case that required significant investigation before anything could be argued in court, and Chukwuemeka spent the first 6 weeks simply gathering the records, the accounts, the full picture. He gathered carefully. He gathered the way he had been taught to gather, by a woman who gathered everything because you could not know in advance which piece would be the one that mattered. He was becoming, his colleagues observed among themselves, someone whose name was starting to be mentioned when difficult cases needed someone who would not cut corners and would not be moved by obstacles. This was a quiet kind of reputation, not the kind that appeared in profiles or on platforms, but the kind that lived in the judgments that colleagues make about each other over time, which are usually the most accurate. He did not think about his reputation. He thought about the case in front of him. He called his mother on a Tuesday evening from the bus home. It was raining. The kind of Lagos rain that arrives all at once and transforms the city in minutes, filling the gutters and filling the air with the particular smell of wet city that is both unpleasant and completely alive. She picked up and said, "Where are you?" He said, "On the bus. It is raining." She said, "I know. I can hear it." He said, "I have a new case. It is going to take a long time." She said, "Tell me." He told her. He summarized the situation, the young man, the false record, the circumstances, the investigation he had begun. He told her what he expected the challenges to be. He told her what his approach was going to be and why. She listened. At the end she said, "What does the young man need most right now?" He said, "To believe it is solvable." She said, "Then start there." He said, "I will." The bus moved through the rain. Outside the window, the streets were rivers. People huddled under awnings. A woman walked through the rain without hurrying, holding a child's hand, both of them getting thoroughly wet, the child apparently finding this amusing. He watched the woman and the child through the rain-streaked window. He thought, this is what it is. You walk through the rain with someone small, and they find it amusing, and you let them find it amusing, and you keep walking. He said to his mother, "How are you?" She said, "I am well. I am always well." He said, "I know you are not always well." She said, "I am well enough to do the work. That is the relevant kind of well." He said, "All right." She said, "Come Sunday." He said, "I will come Sunday." He put his phone away and looked out the window at the rain. Sunday would come. He would go. They would sit at the table. There would be food and tea and a lamp and a conversation that covered everything important and some things that were simply pleasant and some comfortable silence. This was how it was. This was how it was going to be for a long time. He was not in any hurry for it to be different. The bus stopped. He got off. He stood in the rain for a moment before he reached the awning of the building where his apartment was, getting wet in the way that the woman with the child had been getting wet. Not dramatically, just getting wet, because it was raining and he was outside, and that was simply the situation. He went inside. He dried off. He put the kettle on. He opened his briefcase and looked at the young man in Abia's file. He had work to do. He did it. And the rain came down on Lagos, which does not care about the rain, which has always stood up through rain and heat and the accumulated weight of all the things that happen in it, and continued to be exactly what it is: loud, alive, full of people building things. Full of two people in particular who had been building something for 24 years and were nowhere near finished. The work goes on. The record is correct. And the lamp is on.